this for real. So right now I am seeing that it is prepping. Let me just see what's going on. Okay, so we are good to go. I can see that we are currently live streaming on YouTube. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. So while I'm getting prepped, for those of you joining us via Zoom, welcome. Also, to those of you joining us via YouTube, welcome. Just FYI, the YouTube stream is about on a 20-second delay. So just be aware of that. If the timing seems weird with what I'm saying and you're typing in, for example, in the chat box, and it seems like I am moving on without you, that's why. We're going to try to minimize that, but 20-second delay is pretty substantial for people doing instruction. So we'll do our best today, and I'm really glad you guys are here, especially for those of you in Western time zones. This is pretty early for those of us on the teaching team today in California. It's about 7 a.m. and I usually don't start my workday for another hour. So for those of you west of us, thank you so much for coming. I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can get started. Bear with me a second while I do that, and then I'll check and make sure that it's working on the YouTube channel. Share screen, onto that screen, share. I know this doesn't make for good YouTube television, me talking to myself about screen sharing, but this is how we're going to get it done this morning. Oh goodness, what are you doing? Sorry, it's picked the wrong. So we're just going to go with this because I believe this will work. Let me just check and make sure that YouTube is doing its thing. Okay, I see that one is getting started. Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure you guys can hear it because I've got the headset. My cat is running back and forth across the house right now. Good timing, Kitty. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sorry, I'm going to leave the slides this way because my computer is being unfortunate, but this will do, I believe. Let's make this as big as we can. All right, so welcome to Intro to QGIS for QGIS North America 2020. This is the first session of the conference. We are running concurrently right now with another Intro to QGIS session in Spanish. If you're looking for that one, I recommend that you go to the conference website and there's a link for live streaming for that session on the website. Okay, sorry, I have a little bit of audio issue right now. Okay, so I recommend, again, if you were looking for the Spanish language one, go ahead and find the live stream link on our conference website. I would say that in Spanish, but I'm teaching the English one for a reason because I don't speak Spanish very well. So, all right, so moving on, again, welcome. This is QGIS North America 2020 and the Intro to QGIS workshop in English. Today, everything that you're seeing this Friday and then for the next 2 Fridays for the QGIS North America conference is free. We decided not to have any registration fees because everything that we're doing today is on volunteer time. We have no corporate sponsors for this conference. We have, in fact, no sponsors at all except for our works that are allowing us to do this on work time for those of us who are organizing. So we thank our employers for that. If you are able, we are suggesting that you make a donation to support the maintenance and development of QGIS. You can do that. I realize that the link that's showing on the screen isn't clickable with the video. The easiest way to get to the donation page is just to go to qgis.org and then click the support QGIS button. That's kind of in the middle of the homepage there. So if you're able to make a donation, that's what we'd like to suggest in lieu of having registration fees. But if that's not an option right now, I know a lot of people have tight finances with the pandemic going on. That's totally cool. We're happy to have you here regardless. So hello, welcome again. My name is Michelle Tobias. I am the Geospatial Data Specialist at the University of California, Davis Data Lab. We are a data science shop where we help folks with research and the whole data pipeline, specifically with data science and data processing and research workflows. Today I have 3 helpers out in cyberspace in various places. So here in Zoom, we've got Leah Nagel, who is University of California, Davis Center for Watershed Sciences staff. I just realized I misspelled that. Apologies. And Jason Whitney, who is a graduate student in the UC Davis Geography Graduate Group, where I'm an alum from. So super happy to have Jason here helping too. And then Kurt Mankey is going to be helping us with the chat that's going on YouTube. So I'm happy to have him here as well. He's also very experienced with QGIS, probably the most out of all of us. So hey, Kurt, if you're out there watching. So that's our team today. You'll see them helping in the chat. So when you have questions, you're going to post questions in the chat so that we don't have, you know, a bunch of people contributing audio that could be challenging for instruction. So we're going to have you go ahead and use the chat for that. And I'll explain in a minute how that's going to work. So if you see Leah and Jason and Kurt responding, those are our official helpers, but feel free to help each other. This is an open source tools, open source conference. We like to help each other. All right, so for today's workshop, a little bit about what we're going to be doing. This is an introductory GIS workshop. It's going to be largely a demonstration. I'm going to show you a bunch of things. You can feel free to follow along if you would like. I've provided the workshop data for you to use to follow along. I would say one thing to be aware of is that if you have multiple screens, following along will be easier. If you are working on one, for example, one small laptop screen, your better bet today might be to just watch and then try what we're doing later. The workshop materials will be online forever as far as I'm concerned. I usually update them when we get new versions of the software, but you'll have access to that after the workshop as well. So if you need to just sit back and watch and not follow along, that's okay. Normally we do workshops in person and I would rather do them that way, but obviously we have to do this remote. So pace yourself. If at some point you get overwhelmed and you're following along and you just want to watch, that's fine too. Just take care of yourself today. It's going to be a long haul. We got a 4-hour workshop. I also want to mention this is not a feature tour. I got a couple of emails asking about that and making the assumption that I would be doing just a feature tour. That's not what today's workshop is. This is an introductory workshop, and I'm going to assume for some portion of this that you don't have GIS experience. So that's just for the first part of this. So sit tight if you are already a GIS pro and you're just looking for some QGIS experience. But anyway, that's the plan for today. So let's go ahead and, oops, sorry, click the wrong button, pardon me. Get back to screen sharing. Just trying to open the chat. If you've ever presented with Zoom, you know that as soon as you start screen sharing, it rearranges all of your windows for you. Okay, so today for our Zoom participants, I'm going to walk you through some of the tools that we like to use while I'm doing workshops via Zoom. For those of you in YouTube, I will give you some suggestions for how you can participate as well with the options that you have on YouTube. So if you are on Zoom, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon for the chat. If you haven't opened up the chat, go ahead and click on that and open up the chat window. And what I'd like to have you do is practice using it. So you're going to go ahead and post your name, your location, your job, some kind of introduction. You can be as specific or vague as you like. The reason that I'm having you do this is partially so you can get some experience with the chat window, because that's where we're going to be posting questions when you have questions or if you're stuck on something. But also this helps me justify to my my team in my office that we had a certain number of participants, and look at all the cool places they came from and look at the reach. So if you can do that in some form, that would be super helpful for me. For those of you on YouTube, if you'd like, there's a chat feature there as well. Feel free to introduce yourselves to your fellow participants over there so that you get some experience using that chat window so that when you have questions, you can ask there. I'll give you just a second to do that. I also have to say, it's super cool to be able to share with you guys from all over the world today. I know it's unfortunate that we can't come to one place to do a conference together in person, but it's really nice that we're able to do live streams instead and still get some time to help each other out and do some group learning. So I'm still seeing the chat going, but that's great. We're gonna take a look at some other tools that we're gonna use as well in Zoom today. So the other thing that can be really helpful for me as an instructor is to be able to poll you guys. So if you go back down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see that there is a button that I believe is called Participants. I can't check that because it took away my menu that looks like your menu while I'm screen sharing. But if you click on Participant or Participants, you'll see that there is a poll of sorts. There is a green yes button and a red no button. And so what I'm going to have you do is answer a question for me. So how many of you are new to GIS? So if the answer is yes, go ahead and hit green. If it is no, go ahead and hit the red button so we can see the answer to that poll. There's my participants button. So again, the question you're answering in the participants window is, are you new to GIS? So if the answer is yes, go ahead and click the green button. And if it's no, hit the red button. It looks like most of you have found that, so that's great. I appreciate you doing this. Throughout the workshop, I'm going to check pacing on some things using that feature. It's just a good way to find out, how people are feeling about stuff, whether we need to move on or not. Okay, so great. So before we jump in, it'd be helpful if you guys knew where the workshop materials are. If you registered for the workshop, you got an email that had this linked in it in some way, shape, or form. If not, I'm going to leave this up for a second so you can copy the URL. I know with the video streaming, this isn't linkable, but I can post it in the chat window for Zoom, and hopefully someone can go ahead and paste that for the folks in the YouTube stream. Here we go. Just bear with me a second while I paste the link into the chat window.
I got
it.
Oh.
Go ahead, Leah.
Oh, I just said I'd already done it, but by the time I found the unmute button, you'd already done it. Never mind.
Okay, no worries. It's an early morning for our team. We will. So Leah and Jason will be popping in again on audio to let me know. There are helpers for the day for those of you who are just joining us. The rest of you should please stay muted and leave your video off for now, just so that we can conserve bandwidth. I'm doing this from my home office, which is in my living room, thanks to working from home. So bear with us on that. Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys in the Zoom session if you found the workshop materials. So if the answer is yes, go ahead and there we go. So go ahead and click the yes button if you found the workshop materials. If you need another 30 seconds or so to find that, go ahead and click no, and I'll pause for that. Okay, it looks like most of you so far have found the workshop materials that want it. If you're just watching and you don't care about it, go ahead and click the yes button so I know not to wait for you. All right. So I'm going to switch up some screens here as you guys finish getting your workshop materials. So this is what the page should look like when you find those workshop materials. This is a GitHub repository, and don't worry if that is something that's new to you. We're just using it for the display capabilities for, it makes a nice website for the workshop materials. So don't stress, we're not really going to be using GitHub today, aside from looking at it. Okay, so I think it looks like most folks have found the materials that want them. So let's dive in here. Let's see. So today's workshop is going to be with QGIS. I'm going to be demonstrating on QGIS 3.14. If you have a slightly older version, like 3.12, that will be perfectly fine. When I updated this last week, there were very few changes. So there's a couple minor things that have changed, like labels on stuff, but you'll be able to follow along just fine. Probably even if you have like 3.10, it should be good. If you're working on 2 still, it's going to be way different. So just sit back and watch and do it with an updated version later. So the workshop aims you probably saw on the conference website. But today the plan is we are going to cover some basics for GIS. I'm realizing this might be small for some of you, so I'm going to go ahead and make this font a little bit bigger. So we're going to be covering some of the basics. We're going to learn about different data types, and we are going to load up data into our GIS. We are going to style it, and then we're going to learn about the attribute table for vector data and do some basic querying. And then we are also going to assemble a map. And finally, we're going to do a little bit of spatial analysis if there's time. So we've got a lot on the schedule today. We will be taking some breaks throughout this 4-hour workshop period. That's a really long time to sit. So probably about every hour we'll take a 5 or 10 minute break so you can stretch or get some snacks or whatever it is you need to take care of yourself. Okay. Okay, so what is GIS? Again, I'm assuming you guys don't have a ton of experience with GIS in general, but if you do, just sit back for the next 5 minutes and this will be easy peasy. Okay, so GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems or Geographic Information Science, depending on how you're using it. So when we use the Geographic Information System term, we're talking about basically like the software and the tools that we're using to investigate spatial relationships between data. When we're talking about geographic information science, we're talking about the framework that we're using to answer questions about spatial relationships. It's a good idea to know that these are 2 different options for when we say GIS, but mostly people won't distinguish between them. So I just like to bring it up so that if you ever do hear it, you're like, okay, I heard that in my intro. So today we're really going to be working with the system side of this because we're working with the tools. But when we do the spatial analysis, especially, we're going to be switching over to the science side. It'll be seamless. You'll never notice the difference. Okay, so this is a QGIS workshop. So what is QGIS? Just in case you were unfamiliar with it when you signed up for this, QGIS is a desktop GIS. That means that we are going to be working with a graphical user interface. You'll have windows and buttons to click and forms to fill out when we need to do stuff, which is different than a programming interface, for example. So things will be visual here. QGIS is open source, which means you have access to the code to read or modify it if you want to. You don't have to, but you can if you want to. The big advantage to this is that if something is, if there's a bug, if something isn't working right, anyone can fix it and anyone can add new features, which is different than proprietary software where you don't have access to all the code. That may not matter to you if you're just starting out, but later down the road, that might might be something that you're interested in doing. QGIS is also an official project of the Open Source Geospatial Foundation. So OSGeo is an organization that helps support open source geospatial technologies. They provide infrastructure and organization to the broader community and to help do public education about what open source geospatial software is. They also put on a conference in theory every year, obviously not this year, and then regional conferences. If you've heard of FOSS4G, the Free and Open Source for Geospatial, that OSGeo, Open Source Geospatial Foundation, is the group that puts those on. Often you don't hear about the foundation, you just hear about the conferences, so just want to put a plug in for that. They do great work helping these kinds of projects get going and be maintained. So, okay, so we've talked about what is GIS, we've talked about what is QGIS, but why? Why do QGIS? Why not use some other tool? I'm going to give you a list of reasons that I think are important to me personally. There are other reasons out there. For me, QGIS is a robust, powerful desktop GIS. Sometimes, especially working in the university community, doing consultations and working with researchers, I hear still, unfortunately, the rumor is still out there that anything that's open source is for some reason less than, it's not as good. That is not the case with QGIS. It's really powerful. It does everything that I expect a desktop GIS to do. So it's great. I like it. I've been working with it for a really long time. I actually did all my dissertation work with QGIS, and that was a while back, and it's gotten light years better since that point in time. One of the other advantages I see to this particular software is that it runs on Mac, Linux, and Windows. So we don't have to worry about people having a specific operating system. It runs on pretty much everything natively, which is nice. And you don't have to worry about license issues, dealing with license managers and stuff like that. It's not an issue with QGIS. So for those of you who just want to do your work and not deal with that, that's helpful. Another big thing is that it's free of charge, so you don't have to worry about paying for it. It's there. It's all access. You don't have to pay for other bits and pieces to make your job work. It's free. There's also really frequent updates and bug fixes. And there's a really responsive and enthusiastic community. I mentioned these together because I had a situation where I head up a project at the UC Davis Library that is digitizing the American viticultural areas. And we rely on GeoJSON for our file type. And at one point, there was an update to QGIS that changed how they handled GeoJSON, and it broke our project. So I was able to get on the bug tracker and say, hey, developers, so this happened. This isn't working for us now. Here's why we want you to fix it and make it the way that it used to be. And it was a situation they hadn't considered, and realized that they could fix that. And they did fix it. And in a couple of days, we're back up and running. So that's really cool that we have that community, and that's partially facilitated by the fact that this is open source. You can also integrate this with other geospatial tools and programming languages like R, Python, and PostGIS. So if you are interested in doing things like that, it is totally possible to connect all this stuff up. You also have access to tools like other softwares like GRASS and Saga and Orfeo and all kinds of other things can connect to QGIS, so you can use it all in one spot. That's really helpful because I'm not sure if those of you out there have tried using GRASS before on its own. Having it connected to QGIS makes it a lot easier to use GRASS algorithms. So that's another great reason to use QGIS specifically. You also have native access to formats like GeoJSON and GeoPackage that are open formats. You don't have to do any add-ons or special tools. They just work, which is nice. The GeoJSON format that QGIS uses is also the official GeoJSON format, unlike some of the proprietary software that's tried to write its own version of that. Another thing that I've come across is that QGIS is translated into more than 40 languages. So if, for example, in the university environment, sometimes we're working with folks in different countries or people who their first language isn't English, having the interface for QGIS that's able to be translated so that it's in your native language can be really helpful. So I just think that's cool that that's available. The other thing is that QGIS is growing in use by local, state, federal, and international governments. So it's a good idea to at least know a little bit about QGIS, even if you typically use other softwares or other tools. You may find that this is on the list of things that you might need for future jobs. So hopefully we'll get you a good intro to this today so that you can check that off your list and put it on your resume. Before we jump into conceptual information, I'm going to pause and ask if there are any questions that I can answer. Not seeing anything pop up in the group chat. Okay. So let's go ahead then and jump on into our materials. Concepts first, and then in probably 5 minutes or so, we'll actually open the interface. So if you're dying to open the interface, we're going to get there soon. All right. So you need to understand a couple things about data before we can jump in, because this is important. So there are two main types of spatial data that you'll see when you're working with a graphical GIS. There are many, many other data formats out there. These are just the two most common. We could do an entire workshop on just data formats. So we're not going to do that today. We're just going to stick with two. So the two types of data that you typically see when working with a GIS are vector data and raster data. And then two kind of situations we're concerned about, and that's discrete data and then continuous data. So they kind of have their pluses and minuses. They're intended to do slightly different things, and you'll see that today when we're working with both these formats. So vector data is a lot better at visualizing and working with discrete objects. So when you think about, like, if I asked you, get out a sheet of paper and draw a map from your work to your house. As you're drawing that map, let's say you're inviting a colleague over for dinner and they need to know how to get your house, and you don't want to use, now we get out our phones and show people on Google Maps, or they can do it themselves. But let's say you're drawing this out. You're probably going to draw vector data. You're going to draw lines for roads. You're going to draw a point for your house. Maybe you're going to make it a star because that's the goal. You might represent, for example, the shopping center by your house as a polygon, so some kind of shape that's filled in. So that's vector data. It's really good at representing objects. If we can also use vector data to represent continuous data, but we kind of have to make it discrete. So in the picture you see, we've got contour lines. So we have a continuous field. Let's say it's elevation. Elevations could be any number, right? It could be 1, could be 1.1, it could be 1.12. It could be any number. But when we're representing that as vector data, we have to kind of make it discrete. So we do things like make topo lines. So if you looked at a topo map, that's a vector way to represent continuous data. On the other hand, we have raster data. Raster data is gridded data. So this one I think sometimes is a little bit harder to grasp because it's not how our brains intuitively think about things, but every single one of you, even if you've never worked with raster data before, as raster data have done this when you open up your phone and you take a picture. When you took that picture, you created raster data. It's gridded data, and if you zoom in really, really far into that picture, you start seeing pixels, right? Little squares of color. That's raster data. Each of those squares contains information about what should go in that particular square. So with a picture, for example, that square has information about what color to make the square. If we had a raster that was, for example, our elevation, that grid would have information about how high that cell should be. So what's the elevation within that square? So raster is really good at representing continuous data because we have continuous coverage and we've kind of broken it up into little squares. But if we make the squares fine enough, it's really good for continuous data. You can also represent discrete data, like you're points, lines, and polygons with raster. But as you can see with the image, we kind of have to chunk it up. This kind of looks like, if you're familiar with cross-stitch patterns, if you've ever made a cross-stitch pattern, you've actually gone from sort of vector type data to raster type data to make that happen. So you can fill in the squares. So if that's something that's all I'm going to say about raster versus vector data right now. As we jump into this, as we start loading data, you'll start to see some more of the sort of pluses and minuses, the advantages and disadvantages of both these types. But feel free also to ask questions in the chat as we go. Right, there's some text there too for if you're going to do this later and you want to remind yourself. Are there any questions right now before we move on about raster and vector data? Also remind you, we're going to load all this up into QGIS, so you'll see some examples of it. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat window in Zoom, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. So I'm going to keep working from this this set of instructions, but I'm going to move it off onto my other screen. You guys can follow along too, but I'm going to put QGIS on the sharing screen so that you can see that in a second. I'll quickly introduce the data and then we'll switch over. Okay, so today we're going to be working with some data from the city of San Francisco. This is from, they have this great open data portal. So if you need example data to work with and you don't mind it coming from San Francisco versus, you know, something else, if you just want data to work with, it's a great portal. It's got tons of data in there. So this data comes from that city of San Francisco open data portal. We're going to be working with the digital elevation model, which is raster data. So these are grid cells that have elevation in them. And then for vector data, we're going to be working with street lines. The trees are point data, and that's actually a CSV. Then we have seismic hazard zones. So that refers to places with high likelihood of damage and earthquakes. Important here on the west coast of North America. We unfortunately have earthquakes to deal with. And then also the city of San Francisco boundary, which I believe is labeled as the shoreline in the data set. It's mostly shoreline except that southern boundary. City of San Francisco is not an island as the data set might suggest. And all of this can be found on this box folder online. I will say if you haven't already downloaded the data and you don't have great bandwidth, I wouldn't recommend downloading that now. I'd sit tight and just watch, and then you can download and play with that data later. Also, I'll tell you, when you click on this link, it's going to open up a window, and at the top, it'll have like this green bar that pops up that says, don't you want to join Box? Don't you want to sign in? Just dismiss that. And then once you clear that message, then up at the top right-hand corner, there's a download button where you can download all the data at once. So you don't have to click on each piece of the shape files that are in there. That will take you a really long time to do. So go ahead and click on that download button and get everything at once. It'll download a zip. All right, so I'm going to now switch some screens around. So I'm going to take away the text part. And again, you guys can keep following along on that. I'm also going to remember to stop my video, if I can figure out how to do that. Stop video, because that is going to get in the way of you seeing things if it's still staying up in the corner. Okay, so right now you'll just see my desktop, which is nice and swirly right now. But so first thing we're going to do is we're going to start QGIS. So you're going to start up QGIS in whatever way you normally do. I just recently updated, so mine is here on the menu, but if you're on Windows, you can search. I believe with Mac, you can search and just open up your QGIS as you normally would. All right, so if you've ever worked with QGIS before, you may see that you've got some projects here. You can see kind of some stuff I've been working on for work. If you just downloaded QGIS and you've never started a project, you don't have this, it's blank. So don't worry about that. What matters is we're going to start a new project, and I can do that in a couple of ways. I can click on this new project icon. It looks like a little white page with the corner turned down. Or I can go up here to project and click on new. So project menu, click on new. And then sorry, I'm going to close this so that everyone's will probably look more similar to mine. So now we have QGIS open and we started a new document. Quick little tour of what you're looking at. We have menus up here at the top. Yours will probably look similar to mine. Don't sweat it if your interface is slightly different than mine. I've got stuff in here from having worked with this for a little while on this computer. Also, we have up here some toolbars, various tools that we can click on. The nice thing is you're like, oh my goodness, there's so many tools. If I hover over it, any of these icons, it'll tell me what it is. It'll give me a little tool tip. So I often forget what things are, and so I use that feature all the time. When we add data into our project in a second, you'll see data shows up in this big, what's now white space, but eventually that will look more and more like a map. And then our layers that we add will be listed here in the layers panel. You can think of it as like a table of contents for what is showing up in this main map canvas. Okay, so we've opened QGIS. Step 1 is done. We're going to now add some data. We're going to start with the raster data. So I'm going to click on this, what is now called the Data Source Manager. This little pop-up name on it changed. So if you are working with 3.12 or 3.10, it might say something slightly different. And your button may have showed up in a different spot on your toolbar. They're movable, so they can kind of be anywhere. So you can either click on the icon here, it looks like 3 cards splayed out, or I believe we can add it with, there we go. If we go to the layer menu, we can click on Data Source Manager here in the layer menu. So I'm going to click on that, and now we have this interface. If you're familiar with other softwares, this method of adding data looks a little different than what you're used to, but we'll walk through 3 different options, so you'll have a good idea of how to deal with this by the time we're done today. So we're going to be loading raster data first. You'll notice that in this interface, there is a bunch of different options here on the left-hand side. We're going to work with raster data, so I'm going to click on raster here. The little icon looks like a checkerboard. So this is how we load raster data. We have to tell it specifically what type of data that we wanted to use. This is why in the intro I tell you about raster versus vector data, because you kind of have to know what kind of data you're working with in order to load it. So we are going to click on now. If we had the path for some reason, we could just put it into the box. But if I click on this ... button, it lets me browse my file system to find the data that I want. So I am going to, it remembered from me walking through this the other day that I want my data in my D drive. So I'm going to click on my Intro to Desktop GIS with QGIS folder. I should mention, if you downloaded a zip, you do need to unzip that file so that you can get to the data. So you'll notice, and if I back up, I've got the zip that I downloaded from the box account, and then I unzipped it. So I have my data in an unzipped folder. All right, and so I want to load this dem_sf.tiff file. So I'm going to click on that, and then it does have an auxiliary file here, this XML file that goes with it. We just need to point to the main file, and then the QGIS will know to look for anything else that has a similar name to put it all together. So later on when we see shapefiles, you'll just pick one of them. You don't have to pick all of it. Again, so I'm picking my dem_sf.tiff, and now I'm clicking the open button here in the interface to open it. And now you'll see it put the path to the file here. So I'm going to go ahead and click add. I'm just going to move this out of the way so you can see the result. So this is a digital elevation model of the city of San Francisco. It doesn't really look like San Francisco yet, so we're going to work with that in a minute and make that look a little bit more familiar, a little bit more like land than just clouds and a black sky. So yours should look pretty similar to that. Let's see. So that is how to load raster data. Next up, we're going to load some vector data. I'm looking at the chat to see if there's any questions, and I'm not seeing any. I see somebody saying that they're being asked to transform the DEM. Go ahead and pick the default option that it's giving you if you're being asked to select a transformation. And hopefully that will open it up for you. I'll let the helpers help with that for now, if that doesn't work. All right, so quick poll on Zoom. If you got your raster data loaded and it looks something like white clouds and a black sky, go ahead and hit the yes button in the participant tools on Zoom. If you're having trouble, go ahead and post in the chat, and some of the helpers will go ahead and try to help solve that. Give you a second to respond to that. It looks like everyone's doing pretty good. Not seeing any questions in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. But if you do have questions, go ahead and post them in the chat, and our helpers will try to help answer the question or solve the problem. They're very experienced. They'll do a good job, I promise. All right, so next up, we just did raster data. Next up, we're going to do some vector data, two different types. So we're going to first load some shape files and then some CSV data. So we're going to start with shape files, which are vector data, so points, lines, and polygons. So again, we're going to come back over here to our left-hand side menu, and we were on raster, but we're going to load vector data. So I'm going to click over here on this vector menu instead. The interface looks almost identical to the raster menu, but I will tell you from experience, when you forget to change it, it will confuse the computer if you try to load vector data when you have the raster menu open. I do it all the time. So I'm just warning you, if it tells you your data source isn't valid, check and make sure that you click the right thing on the left-hand menu. So again, we're going to click on this ... button. This will become a running theme for loading data. So it remembered that I was in this particular folder because that's where I went for the last thing. If yours doesn't remember, that's fine. Just go ahead and navigate to where you saved your workshop data. So we're going to load up three things. Shape files, you may notice, like, here's my seismic hazard zone shape file. This one has four files that all go together. I like to think of it as a shapefile entourage. They kind of travel together, they hang out together, but the ringleader of the whole collection is this .shp file. That's the one I want to click on to tell QGIS to open. The other files will just come with it, and QGIS will know to look for those. These particular shapefiles have four files that go together. You may see more or less depending on the shapefile. There's always at least three together. You kind of hope for the fourth PRJ file as well, because you need that information, but sometimes there's more than four. Okay, so I clicked on my seismic hazard zones to add that. You can also, we could just click open and do exactly what we did for the raster and then come back and add another one, but I'm lazy, so I want a shortcut. I'm going to hold down on my computer. I'm on Windows. I'm holding down Control, and I'm clicking on the next one, shoreline.shp. So now I have two highlighted. I can scroll down and then pick my third one, which is the street center lines.shp. So I'm just checking. So we've got, I'm looking at the written materials. So we've got street center lines, seismic hazard zones, and the shoreline. Looks like we've got all three. So I'm going to go ahead and click open. And now you'll see here, we've got sort of a list. You can kind of see, like, here's where it begins with the path. And then there's, if we scroll over, you'll see that there's three paths in quotes. So it adds that for us just fine. I'm going to click the add button now that I've got all three of those in there, and you'll see that I've added more things in my layers panel. And then if I move this out of the way, we've got some data showing up on my map, which is great. So that is how we load vector data. So the last thing we need to load in our data that we're going to work with today is the CSV data. So CSV stands for comma separated value. I've heard variable, whatever, it doesn't matter. What really matters is that this is a text file, and it's kind of like a table, but instead of having like an Excel where you have the cells that look like little boxes, it has commas or some other thing that delineates where the edge of that column should be. So with the CSV, it's a comma, but it could be, for example, a tab delimited file where you have tabs, the character tab between all of the variables in your data set. It could be a semicolon, a tab, a pipe. It could be anything. If you're building your own, I would recommend using something that people aren't going to use in general. I really like pipe because most of the time when you tell people that there's a character called pipe, they don't even know where it is on the keyboard. So they're not likely to use it and accidentally screw up your delimited file because they wouldn't accidentally put a pipe where it doesn't go. So anyway, we're going to use the CSV. That's probably the most common you'll see. And so if you open this in a text file, you'll see a bunch of commas separating things out. So we're going to load this much in the same way that we did the other data. You'll notice here on your left-hand panel in your data source manager, there is this option for delimited text. You notice the little icons of comma. That's because it's for loading CSVs, which have commas as separators. So that's helpful to know. Sometimes having that search image for what button you're looking for can help find things more quickly. So again, we're going to add in our file name, clicking on this ... button. You'll notice this interface looks a lot different. We have to tell it a lot more information so it loads it correctly. But we're going to go ahead and start by loading where we found the data, which is with our button here like we did with the other ones. Mine is defaulting right now to look just for text files. Yours may show all of the files, and that's fine. What you want to do is click on the street tree map.csv file here. So you'll see if you're on Windows, I imagine Mac probably does this too, makes a little icon and it's like, hey, this is an Excel file because I have Excel loaded. And it will open in Excel, but it won't do the same thing. It'll just look like a table. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. You'll see we've got some options up here. So we can tell it what name we want to keep. I'm going to leave it the way it is just so it matches everything in the workshop materials. The character encoding you can change. It's not uncommon to have different character encoding. This one's UTF-8, so I'm going to leave it. But if you needed to switch that, you can, especially if you're dealing with a different character set. Our file format here, I'm going to pick CSV, so for comma separated values. I'm going to just show you really quickly. If I had a custom delimiter, I could click this and I could tell it, oh, I have tabs instead of commas or colons or other things. If I wanted to, it doesn't have pipe for an option, I could type in here and tell it I wanted pipe, which looks like that. So just a straight line. But we have CSVs, so I'm just going to make sure that CSV is clicked, and that's the default. Like I said, it's the most common. But not necessarily great if you have like a free response where people are like, you're collecting data through a typable interface and people can write paragraphs and they might use commas. QGIS can probably handle it. It's pretty good at sorting that stuff out. But in that case, I would pick another character that they're not likely to accidentally type. Other things we need to pay attention to are, here we have this option for our first record has field names. So we're going to leave this checked because our CSV has headers for our columns. So we have the names of the columns as the first row. If you didn't have that, like if you're working with the census data and you didn't want to put those in, you could uncheck that so it doesn't make your first row of data the column headings. I'm going to let it detect the field types. It does a pretty good job most of the time. There's ways around it when it doesn't. For the geometry definition, we have point coordinates. You could have other formats like well-known text, or if you just want to bring in a table that doesn't have a geometry, you can do that. It usually guesses pretty good for which is the X and the Y field. If you have words like longitude and latitude, it usually picks those, but check and make sure that they're right. Sometimes you'll get data sets with multiple lat long variance, and you want to make sure you pick the column that you want. Let's see. What's really nice is at the very bottom here, it'll show you a preview of what your table is going to look like. So if we had picked the wrong delimiter, for example, it might show this as just each row is just one column. But when we pick the right one, it'll split it up. So we can see we've got some data here. We've got a tree ID, we've got some kind of status, species, some address information, some coordinates. Here we have location, which is a combination of the coordinates from the other columns, XY chord. So we want to make sure we pick the right one in this case. So I want lat long because that is in degrees and that makes sense. I don't know what the projection is of this X chord and Y chord. I could guess, but that can be challenging. All right, so this looks good to me. I'm going to go ahead and click add, and we should see we should start seeing a bunch of tree locations pop up. This is a pretty big file, so it may take a second to load on your computer. I'm going to go ahead and now close my interface. Yours may hang for a second, just sit tight and let it load. Looks like a bunch of pink ants marching around as it's loading. But so I'll give you just a second to get that loaded up. So for our Zoom participants, go ahead and look at your participants menu and go ahead and tell me yes or no whether or not you've got your data loaded up. So you should see if you've got everything I have, it might be in slightly different order. You've got your street trees, seismic hazard zones, your shoreline, your street center lines, which you can't see because everything's piled up, and then your digital elevation model. So just so long as you've got those layers loaded up, you're good. All right, so I'm seeing in the chat window, we've got some questions about, about the projection. Let me go ahead and show you that again. So I'm gonna open up my data source manager again. And I'm just gonna load this like we did. I won't add it again because we don't need two of them, but I'll show you how this works. So one thing that you may run into is in the geometry definition section. Make sure you've clicked for this particular data set, point coordinates, pick longitude for the X field, latitude for the Y field, and then for your geometry CRS, I'm gonna click on this button that looks like, I think it's supposed to be a conic projection. It has like a little blue globe and it looks like it's wearing a little hat. I think that's supposed to be a cone, like a paper cone on top of it for conic projection. What I'm going to do is make sure that I pick the coordinate system for lat long, which is WGS 84. If I 4326, if I type in 4326, that's the EPSG code for lat long WGS 84. That's the easiest way to find it. So I'm going to click on that and then click OK. And then you should see in the geometry CRS, it should say EPSG 4326, WGS 84. Apologies for skipping over that. I actually had the wrong one loaded the other day when I went through this and was scowling at the computer and saying, why are my trees not showing up where I want them to? And it was because I had missed that box, which is very easy to do because it's over here on the side. So hopefully that solves it. I'm going to click close on mine because I don't need to add it twice, but you should click add once you've got that. So I'm going to close mine. And then once you've added it, you should have something that looks like this. Your colors will probably not be the same as mine, but don't worry about that. It just picks random colors to start. All right, so how are we doing with the data? I see one person still says that they haven't gotten their data loaded. Are we good to go? Okay, so I think this is a good time. Actually, it's a really good time to learn to save because we just did a lot of work. So let's go ahead and save our data. what I'm going to do is come up here to my menus, and I'm going to click on this blue floppy disk. For those of you who are old enough to remember the days of AOL sending you these in the mail, that's what this is. I'm going to click Save. And it is going to ask me, hey, where do you want to put it? It's suggesting I put it in my Railroad folder, which you'll hear about next week on Friday if you come to that that presentation. But I'm going to put this in my folder where I have my workshop data. So I'm just navigating to where I want to put this. I'm going to put it here. And I'm going to call it workshop map. You can call yours whatever you want, but I'm going to go ahead and click Save. So now we've saved our data. This is a project. So for those of you who are familiar with, for example, the ESRI Tools, you're saving a QGIS file, which is analogous to an MXD file. So if you're familiar with that system, this is the project file we just saved. If you, for some reason, can't find your little Save Data button, you can also come up here to Project and click Save that way. Saving is your friend. It's any GIS has a tendency to sometimes get a little bogged down. It might crash and you'll lose stuff if you don't save. So my mental process is anytime I think I should save, I go ahead and save. Even if I'm in the middle of something, don't wait. You should save because you can lose a lot of work if you don't. Okay. So I think now is a good time to take a quick break. We've been sitting for about an hour. So let's take about 5 minutes to go ahead and stand up and stretch. If you need to, get some food, take care of stuff for 5 minutes, let's come back so on my screen, it's just about 8. Is that right? Yeah, it's just about 8 o'clock. So let's come back at about let's say 8:04, all right, or do the math. I'm in the Pacific time zone, so next hour, 4 minutes after the next hour, I'm going to put up a little sign that says we're taking a break. So if people are wondering where we went on YouTube, then they will know. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mute. I'm going to take a quick break too. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. Feel free to ask questions though in the chat. We'll get to them as soon as we come back. All right, for those of you who are taking a break, I think it's time to come back to the computer. Hopefully you haven't wandered off too far. So while people make their way back, I just wanted to make you aware of where we are in the workshop materials. So we're just about to start the section that says working with raster data. So if you're following along in the written materials and you got lost for some reason, that'll help situate you. So we're going to start with this working with raster data next. So I'm going to move that to my other screen so you can see my QGIS window. So hopefully you had a nice little stretch break, and it's important. It's very important to make sure we move, especially for those of us who are working at home that are at a desk all the time, to make sure we take time to get up, especially in 4-hour-long workshops. So welcome back. We're about to start the working with raster data section of the written materials. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and clear all of the things on my list. I'm just going to uncheck everything in here except for the DEM. So I've got my DEM highlighted here in the layers panel on the left-hand side, and that's the only box that's checked. So if you're brand new to GIS, one of the cool things about the list of layers is that I can turn them on and off, and the order matters, but we'll deal with that in a little while when we get to the vector stuff. But we're going to start with raster data, and we're going to start with working with our digital elevation model. So the first layer we loaded, the one that looks like white clouds on a black background right now. We are about to make this look a little bit more like the peninsulas in the San Francisco area. So we turned off all of our layers that we don't need to work with. So right now we should see our black square here with some sort of white fuzziness going on. If yours looks like that, we're doing good. So the first thing we need to do to be able to style this is turn on the tool that's going to let us do that. So we're going to open something called the layer styling panel. And we are going to do that by going to our view menu. There's multiple ways to open this, but the one that's easiest to show for a workshop is to come up to the top of our menus here and click view, and then panels, and then we're going to check this layer styling option. So I'll give you a second to find that. So again, I went to the view menu, went down towards the bottom and moused over the panels option, and that opened up its own menu. And then again, I'm going to click on layer styling. So if I check that, it's going to close that option and show me the layer styling panel on the right side of my screen. The other option that is a little bit easier is to right click up in any of the blank gray space and pick the layer styling panel from the panels list. So that's another option for you. Okay, so I'm just going to move this. Things moved around. So I just used my little moving tool here that looks like a little white glove. And if you click and drag, you move stuff around. It just makes me feel better to actually see it. Alternatively, I can right click on my DEM in the layers panel and click zoom to layer, which actually centers it better. That's just a quick little handy trick. We'll use that later too. Okay, so now we've opened up our tool. I'm going to make sure that this is highlighted over here in the layers panel. You can pick the option for what layer you want to deal with up here, but I find it easier just to make sure that it's clicked. But this dropdown does show you all the options. So let's make sure that this dropdown up at the top says we're working with the DEM so that all of the options make sense for raster data. Otherwise, it will be options for vector data and we'll be very confused. Okay, so we now want to make sure that we are on our Symbology tab here. So you have in this interface on the left side, you have what amounts to little tabs. There's other things you can pick and they'll highlight, but I want to make sure that I'm clicking on this one that looks a little bit like looks like a paintbrush that's painting a rainbow. That's your Symbology tab, for lack of a better word, area, something. So that's the one I want. So I'm working with Symbology right now, which basically means how things are symbolized or what they look like. Okay, so right now at the top here, it says we're working with single band gray for our options. I'm going to click on this drop-down menu where it says single band gray and pick instead single band pseudo color. So it's this one that has like the little rainbow icon next to it. This is going to let us work with some colors. So again, pick single band pseudo color. And my data disappeared. I'm not going to worry because it just doesn't know how I want to style it. But we're going to fix that in a second and we'll come back. All right, so we have a bunch of options here. At some point, you'll want to spend some time playing with this. You'll get a better feel for the interface. I'm just going to show you some things that work right now. Cross my fingers, hopefully. And you can play with this for your own data or play with the workshop data and get a better handle for it. So this, we're going to pick band 1 here for the band. This raster only has one band, so it only has one layer. You can have rasters, especially satellite data, for example, or air photos that might have multiple bands to them. This one only has one though, which is nice because then we will all be for sure using the same one. Let's see, I'm looking at my instructions to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, so we are going to next click on this area that says min-max value settings. If I click on the little triangle, it's going to expand. Anytime you see one of those little triangles in this interface, it's a there's more options in there. It's just collapsed. Does not take up space. We want to look at them. So I want to make sure that I have min-max selected. Again, you can play with these options. They work differently, can be more useful with different types of rasters. Right now, this extent is for the whole raster. You can pick other options, but I want to make sure we've got whole raster selected. And then for accuracy, I'm actually going to pick this one that says actual and then slower. The reason that I want that is because this is a fairly small raster, and I want to make sure that we get the whole range of values. If this was a really big raster, like I'm working with, like earlier this week, I was working with WorldClim data, which is the whole world, tons of data in this data set. I don't want to do actual because that's going to take forever. I want to have it sample, but because we have a small raster, I want to have it look at all the values. So that's why I'm picking this one for the accuracy. Sampling is better for big rasters. And then, so that's going to help it determine what the min and max values are. The next thing we need to look at is some of the actual styling information. So I want to make sure that my interpolation, I'm going to change my interpolation type from linear to discrete. And now stuff is showing up, which is both reassuring that the data is still there, but also disturbing because, my goodness, that's a lot of red. But that's okay. We'll fix that in a second. It really does not look like the city of San Francisco yet. Okay, so then from our color ramp, I'm going to right click on, yours may have picked a different color ramp, and that's okay. I'm going to right click on the color ramp itself and select create new color ramp. This is just going to let us get into an interface that has some more options that are already predefined. So instead of gradient, I want to pick this catalog option for CPT-city. So I'm going to click on that catalog, that first catalog option, and click OK. These are a bunch of predefined color ramps and various color options. I'm going to click on the topography option in that left-hand panel, scroll down and click topography. And then I want to pick the CDA option. This one's really nice for elevations that, so I'm going to click off of it so you can actually see what the screen looks like. It starts with blue, so and goes up through white. It's really nice for working with elevation data where you're going from the coast all the way to the top of mountains. It's not so good if, like, I was working on a map for the Central Valley of California in the foothill area, and I picked this one because I was like, oh, I like the colors on this, but then it made it look like the Central Valley was flooded because the lowest elevation was in the valley, and that was not a good choice. But this is a good choice today because we're working with a coastal area. So again, CDA is a good option here. You can pick whatever you want. Play with it, see what you like. but I'm going to pick that one and click OK. This one is a lot less intense on my eyeballs, which makes my brain happier. So there's that. Okay, so if you don't have the live update down here checked, you can go ahead and click apply. If you do have live update turned on, it'll already show you stuff, which is great. Sometimes it's good to turn that off if you're working with a lot of data and you just want to make selections and you don't want it to try to update as you go. But let's leave that live update on for now. Okay, so we've changed our colors. This is not great yet. It's going to get better. And we shall fix this. I'm going to change this back to linear really quick. So I changed my interpolation back to linear so that it would show you all of the color range. This looks a little better, but we're going to fix this a lot more. Oops. Sorry, I'm just going to zoom to layer. Okay, so again, we can do better than this. We can kind of see some hazy stuff down here that doesn't, this is land, but doesn't look like land yet. So let's do some finishing touches on this to make it look a little bit better. Oh, I'm remembering to save. So I'm going to go ahead up here and click save so that in case my QGIS decides to stop working, then I will have that progress saved. So I see someone in the chat is asking about the color ramp. So I'll go ahead and show you that again, Mimi, so that you have that. So again, in my layer styling panel, I am clicking on this part that says color ramp. I'm going to right click on the color ramp itself, select create new color ramp. We're not actually making a new color ramp. It's just how we get to the thing we want. Instead of gradient, I'm going to pick catalog CPT-city. And then I'm going to click OK. And that's going to open up, sorry, we will fix this. It just changed mine to a really intense blue in the background. So I am on the left-hand side here. I'm going to scroll down and click on topography. And then in the topography options, there's a whole bunch of things. I want to pick this one that's called CDA. Mine are not in alphabetical order, which is annoying to my brain, but that's that. You just have to find it. So it's kind of in the middle of the pack there. So CDA, and click OK. And now I'm back to something that makes my brain happier. So I'm seeing some questions about the raster values. I'm going to go ahead and let the helpers help with that, just because I think that is something that they can help solve for the person having that issue. One thing you can do is go ahead and set your min and max values in the actual in the printed materials for the workshop itself. At the bottom of this section, it tells you what the min and max values are, so you can copy and paste those into the min and max of your layer styling panel in case you need to. Sometimes it will set the values to INF, which is infinite. And I'm not sure why, but anyway, you can, if you need to, you can type those min-max values in by hand. And again, that number is in your written notes in the GitHub notes. So I'll give you guys a second to work that out. What you can't see because my video is off is that I just accidentally poured tea all over my front. But, you know, that's me in a workshop. Okay, so I think it looks like our question is solved in the group chat. Quick show of hands. How are you guys doing? Is everything good so far? Go ahead and give me a yes if you're ready to move on, and click no if you need another minute to troubleshoot anything or ask some questions. Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of yeses. I don't see any no's popping up. So I think we're good to go and move on. Okay, so again, this looks okay, but obviously it's not what I expect the city of San Francisco to look like yet. So I'm going to keep making some changes to this, and we'll show you. I keep clicking in that spot and it keeps moving it. You think I would learn to stop doing that. Okay, so we're gonna make some more changes in this and make this look a little bit better. All right, so we're back in the layer styling panel here, and we're gonna make some more changes to this from this interpolation dropdown. Now I'm gonna change it to discrete, and you'll see it made some changes. Nothing drastic. This is just going to help us change the way that we break up the values in the interface down here in this part of the interface. So down below the part where you have all the colored boxes, there's some more options. For the mode, instead of continuous, I want to make sure it says equal interval. So this is just going to be, this is the starting point for how we're going to break this up. We're going to actually change the breaks ourselves, but equal interval is a good way to start. And then right now we've got 5 classes, but I think if I'm remembering right, yes, we want 10. So I'm going to change the number of classes to 10. So again, our mode here is set to equal interval and the number of classes is 10 now in the interface. And if you actually wanted to count, you'd see it made 10 colored squares. Basically, it sampled 10 colors from our color ramp here at equal spacing, which is fine. That's what we wanted to do. We're going to work with the breaks now so that the coastline actually looks like the coastline. And again, if you're following along in the printed materials, I've already given you the breaks that I used in the last time I went through this, but we'll walk through this. So if you wanted to just copy and paste numbers, you can pull that from there. Otherwise, you can just type. All right, let me just make sure I've got all the things we need. Okay, so now we're going to adjust the breaks on this. So breaks being how we're splitting up the elevations into certain colors. So right now we've got starting from 0 up to elevation of, in this case, 31 meters. It's going to be colored blue. That's why it looks like the city of San Francisco is flooded, because we're assigning what my brain thinks of as watercolor all the way up to 31.5 meters. I want to make my break at 0 here. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on this first value next to the blue, and I'm going to type in 0 and hit enter. There's my coastline. That looks a lot better already. So what this does is say, from your lowest value, which I think is -9 or something, it changed mine to 0 and infinity too, but yeah, so I'm looking at the printed material. So the lowest value in this DEM is somewhere around -9. So from -9 up to the value 0, we're going to color those raster cells blue, which is good because in my mind, 0 elevation is the coastline. It's sort of where the water is. We've got some kind of stuff out here, which I'm guessing probably has to do with seawalls or just kind of randomness in the way the DEM was created. I'm not going to worry about that today. If I was doing research with this, I would definitely investigate the heck out of that and understand why I've got some stuff going on that looks very linear and artificial. But for today, I'm not going to worry about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and change some of our breaks to make the rest of this look better. So my next break, I'm going to put at 50. And these are kind of arbitrary. This is, again, for visualization. If I was doing this for research and repeatability, I would probably pick something else to break this up. And again, this is just for display. We're not actually changing the values in the raster. We're just changing how they are being shown. So my next break, I'm going to pick 75. Oops, you see what I'm doing. And then I think 125 was my next one. So as I do this, you'll see that the image changes and kind of gets a little bit better resolved. So my next one, I'm going to make 175. Scrolling down. Then what did I do? Looks like 225. And you can put in any value you like, play with it. You know, it's not something you can really break. You can always reload the data. Do 275 for the next one. And these upper ones are just kind of arbitrary. You'll notice they're not quite linear, and that's okay. Because again, we're just making this for visual purposes. And then my last one, I think I wanted 350. And again, the numbers for these, the breaks that I did for the last one that seem to work, are listed in the written material. So if you can't see all of what I've got, that's okay. You can look in the list in the written materials to get that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click save. save because it's important so we don't lose it. So this looks a lot better than what we started with, which was that black background with white blobby looking clouds. Okay, I must have hit my mouse. It just zoomed for me. I'm going to go ahead and zoom to layer. Okay, so it looks more like we would expect the peninsula on the city of San Francisco to look. And we've got some elevation. We can see that, you know, there's some topography going on here. We can see roughly what the coastline looks like. And so for visual purposes, I think this is a lot better of an option. And then so that this is just one look at how to style raster data. There is a lot more you can do with raster, including analysis. Like doing raster analysis could be another entire workshop. So this is where we're going to leave it today for raster data. But if you look in the workshop materials, there's a link to the QGIS training manual raster module, which can teach you a lot more about how to work with raster and how to do some analysis with it. But for today, this is where we're going to leave the raster learning part of it. And we're going to switch over to vector data next. So I'm going to pause for a second and see, are there any questions about where we're at or any questions about raster data in general? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions popping up in the chat, so I think we're good to go for the next part. If you haven't saved, go ahead and click save. Sometimes I think I need a little thing that pops up and says, remember to save. Okay, so we're going to switch over now to working with vector data. So if for whatever reason you're following along and raster data just isn't working for you right now, don't worry about it because the next part isn't going to rely on this section. So we can just go ahead and let's go ahead and uncheck our DEM because we're not going to work with that for now. It'll be there waiting for us if we want it later when we make a map, but for now we don't need that. So let's see. So we're going to go ahead and turn off our DEM and then we are going to turn on our street center lines. One thing I'm going to do too, which can be helpful, is right now for the way I loaded my data, the streets are kind of underneath a whole bunch of other polygons. So for example, if I turn on my shoreline, covers it up. That's not good. So I'm going to click on my street center lines. I'm going to click and drag. And as it goes up, you may or may not be able to see there's a little line that tells me where it's going to drop it when I release my mouse. I'm trying to aim for right under the tree layer. So I'm going to go ahead and release and it will now, if I turn on the shorelines, for example, you'll see that the roads are on top of the shorelines visually. That's just for later. We'll need that in a second. But there are roads. I'm going to right click and pick zoom to layer just so I can see them a little bit better. So you'll notice that the roads are represented as lines, which, you know, you're probably thinking, well, duh, it's a road, it's a linear feature. Of course it would be a line, but it could be polygons depending on the scale we're working with. But in this case, these particular roads are represented with lines. And yours may be a different color, like mine today is purple. I remember when I first was writing this workshop, everything, all the colors I was picking was like a really angry red. So yours may be a different color and that's okay. We're gonna fix that in a second. I would not pick purple to represent roads most of the time. So we'll fix that. Okay, so we're going to be working again in our layer styling panel. If you make sure that your street center lines are clicked in your layer panel, you'll see that it has switched over to street center lines, or you can click on your drop down and make sure that it's picked there.
Hey, Michelle, quick question about, is there an autosave option for QGIS?
There might be. That is a good question. That would be a good one to ask Kurt later. I don't think Kurt's on the call on the Zoom session, but he may be over in the YouTube session. There might be, but I wouldn't, to be honest. Okay, somebody says autosave plugin. Yeah, that's great. I would still encourage you to remember to save too, because you don't want to rely on that. It's good for backup if you turn on the autosave option with the plugin. But I would make sure that you save anyway because you don't want to lose anything. I have, you know, everyone has those days, you know, when you've been working and you're just plugging along, you're getting all this stuff done, and then it crashes and you realize you were not saving. So remember to save. Yeah, but it's a good option to know that you can do the plugin. I'm not going to show you plugins yet. If we have time at the end, remind me and I'll show you how plugins work. But let's get through this stuff for now. But that's great. Thanks, Leah, for bringing that up. So we're going to be working on our layer styling panel here, just like we did for our raster styling. But now you'll see that the options look a lot different because we're dealing with lines instead of grid cells. So we're gonna, right now it's set to single symbol. We're gonna leave it that way. Later on, we're gonna do different layer styling types. And then you'll see here in this box in the middle, I'm not sure what this box is called. It probably has a name, but we have line and then simple line. I'm going to click on simple line and you'll see that the feature or the options here, the properties change a little bit. Just know that there's different options depending on whether you click the line or the simple line. See, I'm just looking at the list to see what it is that I want to make sure that I show you here. So I'm going to now change the color of this layer. So purple's lovely, but let's pick something that's a little bit more road-like. So I'm going to right click on the colored box. Mine's purple, yours will be something else. No, that's not the one I wanted. I'm just going to left click on it. That's what I'm doing. So that brings up, I'm going to make this panel a little bit bigger, just dragging it over so you can see what I'm doing. You have different options for picking colors. There's these tabs across the top here. So different interfaces for picking colors in different ways, including this one here. This one's nice because it will remember colors that I've used in the past for various reasons. So that can be handy when I'm working on cartography and I need to keep picking the same colors over and over again. Or if I want to start with one color and then change it up a little bit to make a variation. There's also this dropper option where if I pick it, I can, it turns into a dropper and I can say like, oh, maybe I really like this pink from the shorelines. I can click it and it slurps up the color and makes it the same. I don't want pink roads, so we're going to fix that. So you can work with these different interfaces. They have their advantages and disadvantages. You'll kind of, the more you work with it, the more you'll probably pick a favorite color. So I'm going to pick, in the workshop notes, I gave you a HTML notation for a color. So if I come down here in all the little interfaces, there is this HTML notation. I can clear that out and I can type in a hex code for a color. So in this case, this one I'm going to choose is just 6 sixes, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Nice and easy. It's a dark gray color, which in my mind is a little bit better for roads. I tend to advise people to think like a kindergartner. A kindergartner would not make a blue tree unless that was the only color crayon they had. If they had all the colors, trees are brown trunks with green tops. It's expected, it's easy. So for roads, for example, when I'm doing cartography, roads are black or gray, probably gray, but I'll make those kind of really obvious color choices to start. It just makes things a little bit more intuitive for the viewer. You know, you can make choices as you go to change that up, but that's usually where I start. Okay, so we've picked a gray color. You could also go through these interfaces and pick, you know, some kind of color gray off the color picker list, but it's also easy if we want to all have the same color. If you want to use what I'm using, just plop 6 sixes in this HTML notation and you'll have the same color. So I'm going to go ahead and now that I've picked my color, I'm going to click this little back button to go back to the interface. So now it's not super exciting looking, but we are going to do some more styling on this in a second. So again, now we've taken a vector layer and we've styled it. I've changed the color for single symbol the way we wanted to. And that has its advantages. A lot of times we just need to pick a color and be done. But now we're going to explore some more about the attributes that this particular layer has. So vector data is typically made up of 2 parts. We have the geometry, which is the representation, the points, the lines, the polygons, whatever that shape is that we see on the screen. That's one part, and we call that the geometry. The other part of this is the attributes, which is the information about each of those pieces. So each of these lines here, like this, the freeway that's going on the bridge, has information about it, as well as the location itself. And the way that this is represented typically in a graphical GIS is through the attribute table. So I can see the attribute table if I right click on my layers. So in this case, I'm going to right click on street center lines. And then in the menu that opens up, about the middle of the list is open attribute table. So I'm going to click on open attribute table and it will open the attribute table just like it sounds like it should. So now we can see that we have a whole bunch of rows of data and we can see that there's information in here. The column names are somewhat helpful. If you want to know more about what each of these actually means, there's a README text file in the data download that'll tell you where to find the attribute information about this. But some of the information we care about are like we have the street name, we have the street type. This column NHOOD is the neighborhood. So if you're familiar with the different neighborhoods in San Francisco, that can be helpful information. The other thing that we care about is this class code. This tells us what kind of street it is. So we know that that is in there. That'll help us for some of our cartography in a little bit. So we have a bunch of information in the table, which is helpful. Some of it's helpful, some of it is probably more helpful for the people that made it, which is the city of San Francisco, than someone like me who's just trying to make a map. But that's okay. So the key thing to know about attribute tables is that each row in this attribute table is linked to some entity in our map. So if I pick one of these rows, I can just pick any of them. I'm going to pick row 3. What will happen is it will, in theory, highlight that particular section in our map. However, this is probably a really small street. So what I'm going to do is click on this icon that looks like a little magnifying glass. If I hover over it, it says zoom map to selected rows. I'm going to click on that. And it zoomed in. You can see it's this yellow line. I'm going to use my zooming tools here. I'm going to click on minus and zoom out a bit. I picked probably one of the smallest streets in San Francisco for today. So it's this spot right here. And so you can see that the point of all of this is just to say that each of these rows in the attribute table is linked to some character representation here in the map itself. It goes the other way too. I can select, if I use my selector tool, can click on a segment here and that will actually highlight in the attribute table. If I pop them up to the top, that's not what I wanted. Back to the table. This is the one I wanted. You can see that this is the row and we can see information about that. But anyway, the key information here is that attribute tables are linked to the map itself. So we can click on one and see the other. And also all this information is available to us when we do cartography. So we're going to play with some of that in just a second. I want to make sure that I don't have anything highlighted. So I am going to click on this button here that looks like, if it wasn't so teeny tiny on my screen, maybe it'll be easier to see on your screen. It looks like a yellow box and then a little red no smoking symbol. What this does is it just turns off the selection. It doesn't delete anything like I've had students say, oh no, but it looks like it's going to delete something because it has a red no smoking symbol. It doesn't delete it, just turns off the selection. So now nothing is highlighted, which is what I want. Okay. So we can also, because all of this tabular data is here, I can use this tabular data to do a little bit of analysis that we call select by attributes. So let's say I just wanted to select all of the roads of a certain type. I could go through by hand and pick each row that, for example, has an F code of 5 or class code of 5, but that's going to be tedious with all these little tiny lines that are in this data set. So I want to do this kind of programmatically. I want to tell the computer, do the selection for me. So just so I can see everything, I'm going to right click on my center lines and I'm going to click zoom to layer so I can see everything. Go back to my attribute table so I can see that. Normally I'd be doing this on 2 screens so everything isn't piled up, but obviously that doesn't work for a workshop. So bear with me while I've got all this stuff stacked up. So if I want to build an expression and tell the computer, hey, do the selection for me, I'm going to use the expression builder, which is this little icon here that looks like a script E over the top of a yellow square. So select features using an expression is what it says if I hover over it. So I'm going to click on that one. In the written materials, there's also probably a better view of what that icon looks like to help you find it. And this is our select by expression interface. We're going to build an expression, which is kind of similar to if you've worked with SQL. It's a little bit similar to that, but the interface is going to help us build it. I appreciate the interface because, as you may have noticed, I'm really bad at spelling and making typos. So if I can click on stuff, it's really helpful because then I make sure that I've spelled everything right, just from a practical perspective. So I'm going to open up in the middle here. We have a bunch of options. I'm going to open up the drop down next to fields and values. And that's going to show me all of the column headings for my attribute table. So what I want to do is I want to work with the class code because that tells us what kind of street we have. So I'm going to double click on that and you can see it put class code here for me. It's spelled correctly and it has the double quotes around it to tell the interface that this is a column heading. So column headings get double quotes. Text, when we type in text, gets single quotes. I never remember that. So if I double click and it does it for me, all the better, because then it is right. And I don't have to troubleshoot that. So I've got class code. And then down here, I've got options. I'm going to click the equals button. You can type this in with the keyboard, but those of you who've worked with GIS long enough, you may have remembered a situation with ARC where if you were using this kind of expression builder, if you typed in with the keyboard, it didn't work. So I tend to use the buttons just from many, many years ago. Okay, so we've got class code equals, and now we need to tell it what we want that to equal. So I'm going to come over to this section here where it says all unique. And what this is going to do when I click is it's going to give me all the values that class code has available. This is only a good option because I know we only have, in this case, 7 codes, 0 through 6. If this was continuous data, like my elevation data, this would be a bad choice. Don't do that. If you know you have a lot of options and you just kind of want to see what the format looks like, I will use this 10 samples and it will pick 10 out of the list. If I had like 500 different options, I wouldn't want to use all unique. Okay, so I can see now I've got numbers here, and let's do class code equals 1. Let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to double click and it put the 1 over here in quotes. Normally we would think of the number 1 as being a numeric value, but for whatever reason, when this data set came in to QGIS, it may have been how it was defined originally by the person who made the data set. This is not a numeric field. This is a text field. So in this case, we have to have quotes around 1 so that it knows that we're looking for the text 1 and not the number 1. If we took the quotes off of it, it wouldn't find any matches. So this is a handy way to kind of troubleshoot some of your data issues, looking at what values are there. You can also, there's places where you can see what the type of data each column has, but this is kind of a quick way around this. But also just pointing out that sometimes numbers aren't numbers, sometimes numbers are text. Okay, so we've built our expression. We should have class code equals the number 1 with single quotes around it. And then down here with the preview, it says 0. That means 0 errors, so that's good. If we had screwed something up and it didn't understand, it would give us a little error message here. So I'm going to go ahead and click select features. And now you can see that it selected things in my attribute table. If I scroll, you can see there are things selected. So yours might look like this. It also tells you up here at the top of the attribute table that it has so many features total and it's selected 108. If I move, I'm going to go ahead and minimize this so I can kind of see my, and move this sort of off to the side. So I can see what's selected. All the yellow things are class code 1. So we might be able to make some guesses about what class code 1 is. So you can think to yourself, like, if you're familiar with San Francisco, you might guess this looks like freeways or highways, depending on how you want to call it. But But these are really big roads. These are the ones that people are on to get from place to place and not on the grid itself. So we've got the freeway here that's on the bridge. We've got these major connector streets that kind of swoop through the city itself. So I can start making a guess if I'm looking at each of these individual class codes, what they might be. So we could also, for example, let's say we wanted instead to investigate what class code 2 is. So I can remove class code equals 1 from my list, add class code equals 2, select features, and now we've changed our selection and we can make kind of a guess of what class code 2 might be. The good news is that this data set came with metadata. And again, the README file that comes with the data download for the workshop has the links to where all of this came from, but I've also put the information into the written materials as well. So we don't have to guess. We know what these numbers are, but if we had to, we can play with that and try to figure this out. So if you guessed freeways for class code equals 1, you're right. Class code 2 is highways, and we'll be working with this and you'll find out what the whole long list is. But as you can guess too, there's, residential streets, there's major streets, there's other freeway ramps, things like that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this because we've looked at how to work with the select by attributes. I'm going to again click on the button here in my attribute table to deselect all the features so that nothing is now selected, which is good. I'm going to close my attribute table, I believe. Well, I can always reopen it. You can also unselect things in your selection menu with buttons up here in the top. I believe this one deselects everything. It's got the little red no smoking sign on it. So that just, again, clears out the selection. It doesn't delete anything. Okay. So are there any questions about selecting by attributes before we move on to the next piece? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the Zoom chat. Give you just another second in case you're still typing. All right, so we just played with the attribute table. We learned about how the attribute table is connected to the geometries that we see in our map interface. And we've learned that we can connect that data in the attribute table to making selections and investigating spatial relationships and things like that based on attributes. And the selection is great for selecting things and visually seeing it to explore the data, but it's not good for making maps. You don't want to make a map and leave in the selection highlights. It doesn't show up in the legend when you generate it, and also the default is usually either yellow or like that cyan blue color, which is not always a good cartographic choice. We want to make our own choices. We want to set those in a way that makes sense for us. You can change the selection color, by the way. It's in one of the options. I'll let you Google to find how to do that if you wanted to change it. But again, the selection is just for data exploration. It's not for making maps, really. So we're going to now look at how to work with that attribute data for cartographic choices. So we're going to classify our attributes and do our styling based on that. So we've got our roads. Again, our roads are selected in the layers options over here. So we've got our layer styling panel is set to our street center lines. Now, instead of working with single symbol like we had, we are going to work with categorized. So again, our data disappeared because it doesn't know how to categorize it. That's fine. We're going to fix that in a second. So from our value drop-down menu here, we're going to pick our class code. So we're going to be, again, working with our data for what kind of road this is. So 0 through 6, I believe. So this is going to pull our data from the attribute table to do our layer styling, which is super cool. Like, I would really not want to have to do this by hand. So I love that this interface does this. So we're going to keep our symbol as this line. You can play with that. There's a myriad of options for styling. We're just going to be simple today. So let's see, what else do we want to, I'm just checking the notes to see what, make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, so we've got our, okay, so I think we're ready to go ahead and click classify. I just want to make sure I didn't miss any settings that I needed to change before we did that. So what this does is it looks at the attribute table and it says, okay, I've got values 0 through 6, and I'm going to make them all random colors because that's literally the color ramp we picked was random colors. You could change this and you could have it pick any manner of color ramp, or you could use like even the one we used for the raster data. And yours, it's going to pick at random. So yours are going to be slightly different colors than mine, but it's all going to be from this random colors color palette, unless you changed it. This is okay. It's not the best. I wouldn't leave it this way depending on my purpose. Maybe if it was a directions to a unicorn birthday party, I might keep these because lots of pinks and purples in the options that it picked for mine. But even then, I'd still probably pick my own colors. I'm not, you may notice I'm not a huge fan of leaving the defaults. The defaults rarely are what I actually want. So that's fine. It's a good start, but let's go ahead and fix this and start changing this to be the way we want. So the cool thing is we can see that each of these class codes got its own color. And so now we can kind of start to pick out some things that maybe help us make sense out of this road situation. So in our list, it categorizes everything, and then it always has an option for stuff that isn't categorized. I'm going to uncheck that because this data set, everything is categorized. But if you didn't have it, if you had an option that was just blank, for example, which happens for a lot of really good reasons, that is a good thing to have, but we don't need it for this particular data set. So I'm going to uncheck it just so that it's not causing my brain any trouble. And I'm not worrying about it. Okay, so we're going to uncheck that last all other values. If I make this bigger, you can see it says all other values. We don't need that. I see someone in the chat says this new business idea to make unicorn maps. You could totally do that. Now's a good time to start a new business if you're stuck at home. Okay, so we are going to, sorry, I'm just reading the notes here, make sure that I am on the right track. So we're going to select all the symbols. What I want to do in this case, the goal for this is, because these are roads, what I want to do is I want to make them all the same color, but I want to indicate what kind of road it is based on the width of the line. So for example, freeways, the big roads that are big important roads will be wider than, say, for example, residential streets. I'll make the residential streets fairly small. So I want to make them all the same color to start, and then we'll mess with the way that it's symbolized after that. So I'm going to click on my first symbol here with the value 0. I'm going to hold down Shift on my keyboard and click on my last one. So I'm going to highlight 0 through 6. So again, I clicked at the top, held down Shift, clicked at the bottom, and it highlighted everything. There are many ways to do what I'm about to do. So if you already know a different way to do this, that's totally cool. Again, the goal is just change them all to the same color. So I'm going to right click anywhere in my highlighted space, and I'm going to click change color. So again, I right clicked and I'm going to pick change color. And now we're back to our color interface. You saw this earlier. So we could go back to our color that we had, which was all 6s. I think for this section, I had a slightly lighter color. So this one is alternating A and 0 3 times. A0, 3 different times. Make sure I got that right. Okay, yeah. So now when I click off of that, I've got this kind of medium to light gray color, which you might be like, Michelle, why did we change? Just click the back button. So why did we change? Why did we classify this if we're going to make it all the same color? Don't worry, we are going to fix this in a second. So again, I click the back button to come back to my interface, and now we can see I've got all of my roads the same color. Now what we're going to do is work with some of the legend stuff, and then we're going to work with the width of the roads itself. But first, let's give these a label so that we know what we are working with. This will help situate our brains. So from the metadata that came with this data set, we're going to label the different types of streets, because the 0, 1, 2, 3 thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense to my brain. I'd rather have labels in plain language. So what I'm going to do is click on the legend. In the legend column, I'm going to click next to the 0, and you can see it allows me to edit this now. So for value 0, I'm going to type in private streets. So those are streets that are not publicly maintained. For those of you outside of the US, you may or may not have these. They're like roads in special neighborhoods where the city isn't responsible for maintaining those. So if I click off of that, notice nothing's changing in the map itself, but the labels over here in the layer panel do change, which is going to be helpful later for identifying things. And again, the things I'm changing, all of the text is in the written documentation. So if you want to go over there and follow along, that might be helpful, or copy and paste. So I'm going to click on my 1 in the legend. I'm going to change the legend for 1 to be freeways. And then I'm going to click on 2, and 2 is going to become highways. See, isn't this better already? Now we have actual words for these things. And then for 3, I'm going to change 3 to major streets. So you can think of these as like the big streets, like the ones that they're not freeways or highways, but they're like the big ones that help you transport across the city, like Market Street probably in San Francisco is probably labeled as a major street. So for 4, these are going to be secondary streets. Now you all are experiencing the pain of my left shift button not working great today. A lot of typos. So for 5, we're going to have local streets. And then for 6, these are freeway on-ramps. So we're going to call those freeway ramps. So again, this is just for, one, it'll show up in the legend when we make a legend in the map, but also that way we can kind of see what these actually mean, because the numbers don't make a whole lot of sense for the types of streets. We don't refer to streets by numbers generally. Okay, so that's good. Now we this will help us with the next part, which is changing the road width based on the kind of street it is. So what I'm going to do is for our legend here, I'm going to click on the first symbol, which is the first gray line next to the 0. If I double click on that, it's going to open up, again, the styling interface for this particular line. We can leave the selection up here at just the higher level line. So it's going to change the width of the whole grouping. What we're not going to see today is that you can actually stack up multiple lines. For example, if you wanted to do like a black road with the yellow dash line down the middle, you could do that by stacking them up. That's why there's only 1 here, because we're only going to have 1, but you could have multiple lines. So we're going to deal with the whole group here. For the width, I'm going to leave this one at 0.26, but now you've seen where we changed that. So I'm going to go back. For the freeways, so category 1, I'm going to double click on that line. And this one, the width, I'm going to change to 2.0. So freeways are big. They are something we need to be aware of. So we're going to make that pretty large. And these are going to kind of look a little chunky, I think, on the screen for sharing, but you can see an example of this on a slightly different screen in the printed material. So there's that. So I'm going to double click on the line next to 2. I'm also going to change the highways to 2.0, because honestly, highways and freeways in my brain are the same thing. So they're going to get styled the same way. For major streets, I am going to label that with a width of 1. So they're big, but they're not as big as freeways. So you can kind of see I'm kind of making a hierarchy here for the size of the roads. For 4, for secondary streets, that's going to be the default 0.26. The same for local streets. So I'm not going to change that because they're already at 0.26. And then for the freeway ramps, I'm going to make that 0.5 because they're kind of intermediate. They're bigger than some things. They're slightly different. You'll barely see these because there's not very many in this particular data set, but that's typically how I will style street data. Same thing, like OSM kind of has a hierarchy about it too. They're called something else, I think, but if you're working with OSM data, you can kind of do something similar. Okay, so this already looks a lot better. I'm going to go ahead and click save. So everyone remember to save. So this looks a lot better, right? there's a little bit more intuition about what all of these roads are. I may not know that these are freeways or highways, but at least when I look at it, I'm like, oh, these are big streets versus the little neighborhood type streets in the grid. So that is great. This is a little bit, I think, for my brain, a little bit better, and also communicates what was important to me about this data set, which is not only do I have road center lines, but I have information about the road. So I'm using that. Do we have any questions about using the categories for symbology before we move on to the next section? Give you a second in case you're typing. Okay. So we're at the end of a section. We've been sitting again for about an hour. So let's take a quick 5-minute break. Get up, move around, do a little dance, get a snack, whatever it is you need. And then when we come back, I see there's a question in the chat. I'll go ahead and answer that when we come back. So let's, my computer says it's about on the hour of 9 o'clock for West Coast folks. So let's come back at 5 minutes after 9 o'clock, give or take, whatever time zone you're in. So I'm going to turn off my mic for a minute or two, and we'll be back here in 5 minutes. So go ahead and take a quick break, stretch your legs. All right, everyone, welcome back. We'll give you another minute or so to finish up your quick break. And we'll get to, I see there's some questions coming into the chat window on Zoom over the break, which is great. We'll answer some of those questions in a second. I also had a chance during the break to pop over and take a look at what's going on in the YouTube live stream. So thanks everyone for the discussion that you're having over there and for helping each other out and answering each other's questions on over there on the YouTube stream. If you've ever done a live screen sharing workshop with Zoom, there's already enough windows going on my end. So I appreciate you guys helping each other out over there. It's challenging to do all of this. So I definitely appreciate the help, and our helpers, official helpers are doing a great job too. But it's also, this is a community, which makes it even more fun and helpful. So I appreciate everyone jumping in and working together. So before we move on, there was a question about how do you know what the labels should be in the when we're changing the labels and saying what each of these categories is. And the answer is, with this particular data set, it's in the metadata for the data. So this metadata is data about data, and it's an explanation of what each of the columns means, who made the data, that kind of thing. So when I downloaded this from the city of San Francisco, they actually had information about each of the what each of the columns means, and I linked that, I believe, in the README file that comes with the data download for this workshop. So you can actually go and look at the original data source where I actually downloaded the data from. I see there Leah had a question about whether the data has changed since then, and maybe was looking at a slightly different version of the data, which is totally normal because this archive has a whole lot of data in it to find a different one. However, the data that I downloaded was from a couple of years ago at this point, so the data set may have been updated. So if you see the new version and it looks slightly different, that would be expected. I would think that they would be updating this because this is actually data from the city of San Francisco that is used by the city. So this is a couple years old at this point, the data that I'm giving you. But if you get it from the city website itself, it may have been updated and might have changed. But so the answer is, when the short answer to how do you know is someone has to tell you, really. That's why we need to make metadata. I'll just leave it at that. That in itself is a whole nother workshop, but someone has to tell you what that is, or you can play with the data like we did with the attribute selection and kind of guess yourself. That's a less ideal situation, but sometimes it's the only option if you don't get the metadata or any kind of explanation. I see somebody says good data, metadata is so dreamy. Yes, it is. Good metadata is really helpful. So when you get to the point in your career where you start making data, having metadata is a good thing. It's kind of a gift to the people who are using it, which could also be your future self. So I highly recommend it. Okay, so that is a nice small rant on metadata. Let's move on to back to the workshop. So we have just done, we've just looked at how to use our attribute table to make categorized cartography symbols. So we've made our symbols based on the information in our attribute table, which is easy to take for granted, but it's super cool that we don't have to do this by hand. The next thing we're going to do is look at something called rule-based symbology. So we're going to switch over. We've been working with the street center lines, but we're going to start working with the tree data. So I'm going to turn on my street trees. Be a little patient with this. This is a big data set, and we will clip it down in a little bit, so it'll be a little less unwieldy. But just know that this might take a second to load on your computer, and because it's a CSV, that also makes it a little bit more slow than if it was a native spatial type, like if we were using a a geo package or a shape file for this one. It is a CSV, so, and we will change that in a minute, but it can be a little bit slow to load, so be patient with it. Okay, so I've got my street trees loaded. I've clicked on it in the layer panel so I make sure that my layer styling has shifted, but again, I can use that drop down if it's not what I want. And my QGIS decided, because it doesn't read, it doesn't know the word tree, it decided to make them pink today, which is fine. I would not normally make pink trees, but we'll fix this in a second and pick a different option. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is rule-based symbology, and we are going to work with our attribute table again for our trees and do a little bit of analysis. So this is kind of a real-world example situation. This is hypothetical. This isn't necessarily what's actually going on in the city of San Francisco, but it's a plausible situation that we can work through. So in recent years, we've had in California in particular, but other states in the US as well are dealing with this. We're having this influx of little bugs called bark beetles. They're beetles that eat the bark of trees and kill the vascular tissue of the trees. And they are from other places in the world. They're invasive here. And our trees are not equipped to deal with it, especially when we have trees that are, horticultural trees that we've brought in from other places. So these bark beetles can cause damage to trees and sometimes even kill them. So the scenario that I thought of to look at was, we have all this tree data for the city, and you can see this enormous number of trees that the city is responsible for dealing with. Each of these points is a tree that the city actually maintains. These aren't backyard trees. These are like trees that live on the street or in front yards that the city maintains. So what would happen if these bark beetles come in? Where would be a problem? Certain species are more susceptible to these beetles than other species. So maybe we'll pick a species to look at and see what its distribution is, and start looking at, what could possibly be one of the effects if one of these bark beetles came to the city of San Francisco. So one of the species, one of many species that's affected by some of these beetles is the canary pine. And they're pretty common trees for people to plant in California because they're nice big trees. They provide a lot of shade, and they're nice to look at. So they're pretty popular to plant. And I also, if you want to know more about specifically about the bark beetles, I have a link in the workshop materials to the UC Davis IPM Integrated Pest Management site. You can read a lot more about those there. But so we're going to make our goal is to make a map of where canary pines are in the city of San Francisco and start looking. That'll help us do a little bit of spatial analysis for where you might want to concentrate efforts if you were doing a monitoring program to check and make sure that, these trees are healthy, and where you might start seeing bark beetles first if they were to show up in their targeting canary pines. Okay, so again, we're going to be working in our layer styling panel. That's the theme of this whole section of the workshop, I feel. And we are going to be working with our street tree data. So again, we selected it in the layer panel. We see that the right panel is selected. It's also a nice tip off when the color is the right color that matches your symbol. Kind of clue you in case you have picked the wrong one, which I do on occasion. So now we're going to work with a different kind of symbology. So instead of single symbol or categorized, we're going to pick rule-based. So this is going to let us make a rule that does our symbolizing. So it's kind of like making our own categories. There are a lot of trees in this data set. So I could do categorized, but then I'm going to have a heck of a lot of categories to deal with. This is going to let me just sort of make my own categories and define them how I want. We're just going to do a rule that looks at which of these points is canary pine, but you could do multiple, you could search for multiple species, for example, and have that symbolized in one way. And hopefully you'll see how to do that once we get into this. Okay, so we have the default rule that it picks is the one that is show everything. I'm just going to uncheck that so that we don't have a whole bunch of points constantly loading and bogging things down. So right now, nothing's showing. That's what I want. I'm going to come down here to the bottom of my layer styling panel. You may have to scroll depending on how much you can see in your window. I'm going to click the green plus button that says add rule if I hover over it. This looks kind of similar to some of the other things we've done. So things should start looking familiar to you. In this label section of the new rule that I've started, this is where I'm going to give it a name. Okay, so right now it doesn't know what to do, so it's decided to show them all in this lovely shade of 70s golden yellow. So that's fine. We'll fix this in a second. But for my label, this is the label I'm going to see. This doesn't change anything for filtering or anything. It's just like the human readable label. So I'm going to call this Canary Pine. Canary Pine. So that I know when I have my rules that this is the one specifically for canary pines. Now in this filter here, what I want to do is I could type this out. Sometimes once I kind of remember how the syntax works, I'll just type in the box, but we're going to use the interface to do this. So I'm going to click on this little Sigma button here. This looks familiar, right? This is the expression builder. It's really similar to when we were selecting by attributes. So what I want to do is, again, just like we did before, I'm going to open up my fields and values. And in this case, because these are trees, we have a different attribute table. I'm going to pick the one that's, I want the column called Q species. I don't know why there's Q in front of it. We'd have to ask the folks at City of San Francisco, but this is the column that has the species information. And actually, I'm going to click, here's a good use of this sample 10. Just, it's not going to necessarily show me canary pine in this list, but it's going to show me what the typical syntax looks like in this column. So I'm going to see that there are, it looks like the way this is set up is I have the Latin name for the species, a space, 2 colons, another space, and then the common name of the species. So I wouldn't necessarily design a database this way with 2 pieces of information in the same column, but this happens. So now we know that this is kind of what we're dealing with. So unless I want to look up, you know, all of this information and hope I do the exact same match for the text that they have, we're going to have to do something a little bit different than what maybe what we would normally do. So right now in my expression builder, I have my quotes around Q species for the column. Now I'm going to type in caps, I'm going to type the word like. Like is a string comparison. So you can think of it as like equals, but for text. And we could have used that in the last expression that we built too, but because we're not going to do something that's precisely equal, we're going to use the word like. Now I could try to guess what the canary pine syntax is in the table, or I could go look it up in the table, but there is an easier way to do this, and that is string matching with a wildcard. So remember we learned earlier that for strings I have to have single quotes. So I'm going to start by typing a single quote, and then I'm going to type the word, the symbol %. % is our wildcard, and what this means is whatever falls in this particular space, it could be anything, and I don't care what that is. Now I'm going to type in the words that I do want to match, which is the Latin name for canary pine. So that is Pinus space and then lowercase canariensis. I don't think I spelled that right. Okay, we will see if I type that right. Otherwise, I will copy and paste from the workshop materials. So right now what this says is, I don't care what comes before it. If you find Pinus canariensis, then that's a match. But I also want to make sure that anything at the end, like if there's a trailing space or something like that, doesn't get taken into account. So I'm going to put a % at the end as well, and then finish it up with a quote, single quote. So what this search says is look in the Q species column, and anytime you see a string that contains Pinus canariensis, consider it a match, even if there's stuff on the front and the back of it. I don't care. I just want to see this particular string show up in the entry for that column. And I can see preview says 0. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And what will happen is it's going to do a search, and in a second it will figure out which points to show up. And what will happen is we'll only see the points in this rule that are for canary pine. And it looks like I did spell it right because I have canary pines showing up and nothing else. If your search doesn't work, nothing will show up, or potentially you might have everything show up again, but your selection should look somewhat similar to this. Again, you can copy and paste the text of that from the written materials if that's easier. I know sometimes in a workshop, trying to type things in Latin is not the most fun thing to do, so you can copy and paste out of there. Now I've already told you, this is not my favorite color. It's kind of like UC Davis yellow, which is kind of strange. So I'm going to go ahead and change this. I'm in the marker symbol. I've clicked on simple marker. So just the level that gets me to this, the circle itself. For my fill color, I think in the workshop materials, I actually picked an orange color because I wanted it to stand out. So I'm just going to pick off the list. You can monkey with this or pick whatever color you want. If I wanted to be super literal, I'd probably make my trees green. But I find with the grays in the background, orange is a good color to pop sort of off, kind of pop up off of the orange or off of the gray. So the fill color is the center of the dot. And then I can also change the stroke, which is the outside, the line around it. Sorry, I'm clicking on the black. This is where having the different interfaces can be helpful. So actually what I can do is I can pick the color that I had before, that orange. And if I just want to make it a slightly darker color for the outline, I can do that. It's kind of a brown. That'll work. So they're pretty similar colors. Maybe I'll change this and make it lighter. Make it a little more yellow. Not doing a great job picking colors today. That's all right. So give that a chance to load, and we'll see if we like that. Okay, so I've got some sort of orangey brown dots on a gray background. That'll do. If I was going to finish this up for a published product, obviously I would spend some more time on changing the colors. But for workshop purposes, this is great. So again, this is the interface where I've written out my filter for my rule, and now I've changed the way that it's styled. So I'm going to click the back button now that I've accomplished that. You can see it's listing our two rules. It's our one that has everything, that has your default color, and then we have the canary pine one. Okay, so that looks good to me. So now we can take a look at this and we can say, all right, now we know in the city of San Francisco where the canary pines are. And if we think that canary pines are particularly susceptible to this situation with the bark beetles, we can start to think of where we would want to focus our attention. So if I have a crew that's going to go out and sample and look for these bugs and see if they've shown up, where am I going to send people? Probably not to like this area, right? I'm actually, as a biologist, I'm like, this street right here is where I'm sampling, or possibly over here. It looks like there's a lot of trees. They're all in a line. So if these things are going to show up in the city, they're probably going to show up where there's a big cluster of these trees. And this is also really easy for a crew to just walk straight down the street and check for these bugs. So now this is an example of doing, we've worked with the way that we symbolize our data to do a kind of spatial analysis, a visual analysis, but still it's an analysis. So I'm going to go ahead and click save. We've done a lot of work and we want to keep that. So are there any questions about the rule-based symbology so far? Normally at this point in the workshop, if this was an in-person workshop, I would give you a challenge to pick another species and add a rule on your own, and then you'd work through that. But given that we're online, I'm not going to do that right now. I will say, if you want to do this on your own later, I find it completely funny and somewhat satisfying that the city of San Francisco has a lot of carob trees. So that's a tree that makes pods that are kind of like a chocolate alternative. So you might actually want to consider at some point making your own rule and mapping out where the carob trees are, because they're not necessarily susceptible to bark beetles, but I think it's kind of cool that we have carob trees hanging around in the city. So there's that. I'll give you another second to type any questions you might have about what we just did. Okay, so I'm seeing a question. that could you export this is a separate layer for faster redraw time? Yes, and we're actually going to do that in the next, not in the next section, but the last section of the workshop. I'm going to show you how to subset the data into a new layer because yeah, this one can be pretty slow. It is a big set of trees, but sometimes one of the lessons to learn with spatial data is sometimes patience is really important. But it can be annoying if it's taking a really long time. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions. I think we're good to go to the next thing. So we've got 2 more sections. We're doing really good on time. So keep those questions coming as you have them. And then if we do end up finishing early, then we'll take some time to answer questions and you can ask me to show you stuff and we'll just have kind of an improv session. But okay, so the next thing is we're going to use what we just did, the analysis that we just finished to make a map with a print composer. If for whatever reason the street trees are being really annoying and not loading, you can go ahead and make your print composer map without the street trees in it. You've got plenty of other layers to work with, but I'll show you with the street trees that I've got. So again, we're at the section of the workshop, if you're following along, that's titled Making a Map with the Print Composer. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to make a map, which is probably one of the things you've been waiting to see. Okay, so this is a really common task in GIS, right? Like we load up layers and we do stuff, but we also need to communicate it to a non-GIS audience. And so one way we can do that fairly easily is to make a static map that either becomes a image that goes into a report, or maybe it gets printed in some way for people to look at. Because we know that not everyone wants to sit at a GIS. Sometimes we need to be able to communicate outside of that. Okay, so we're going to prepare our layers first thing. So anything, the way that this looks right now, any of my layers that are showing up, how they look in the map canvas in the main GIS window is how it's going to look in the map in the print composer for the most part. So whatever color it is here is the color it's going to be. So we can go back and forth too. Sometimes like we'll start the print composer and be like, oh, I really could make some better decisions. And so we can change it. But the first thing I like to do is kind of get things the way I want them. So I have, for example, I've got my street trees. I'm going to make my map is going to be of Canary Pines in San Francisco. So that's my goal. You could make a map of something else if you want. But so I want to have my streets because I think that's helpful to communicate with my audience. And then also maybe I want to have my shoreline because that's going to kind of show me the boundary. You can see my QGIS is sort of stuck in a pink theme today. So I don't really like having the city boundary being pink. So let's go ahead and change that. So this is going to be similar. I'm going to breeze through this because you've seen a bunch of this today. So I'm clicking on my shoreline. I'm going over to my layer styling panel. Simple fill. I'm actually going to change instead of having well, maybe I'll make it white because I want to do a glow on this later. So I'm going to pick a different interface. This one because I can get to white pretty easily. And then down here it kind of went gray, so I'm just going to make it white. Or I happen to know that the hex notation for this is all Fs, but it's kind of fun to play with the interface. Sometimes that's easier. Okay, so I've got my background is white. And then, so I'm going to click back. And then now I want to work with my stroke color. Black is kind of harsh, I think. So maybe I'll pick that, let's try that dark gray that we had earlier. Where'd it go? That one. I like that. Yeah, that could work. Maybe I'll lighten it up just a little. I don't want it to look like the roads, but okay, that's enough playing with that. And then maybe I'll make it, let's see what it looks like if I make it a little bit bigger, maybe 0.4. Maybe 0.5. So when you get into cartography, a lot of it is just sometimes fiddling and playing with stuff until you like it. All right, I think that's probably okay for now without spending tons of time on that. So, okay, so I've got my shoreline on here, which is now this sort of fat dark gray. I've got my roads in here that we styled earlier with the different widths for the different types of roads. And then we've got our canary pine trees that are right now orange, which is fine because I want them to stand out a little bit. So that looks good. I think that's probably all I want in my map for my print composer for now. We can always add stuff in later, but let's call that good for now. And let's kind of open up the print composer. Okay, so we've got everything the way we want it. I'm going to save because I'm by that save button. You should save too if you're following along. So in my project menu, I am going to come down to the new print layout. So again, I opened up my project menu and I'm going to select new print layout. The first thing it's going to ask me is, what do you want to call this new print layout? So I'm going to call it Canary Pines. And click OK. The reason it's asking you that is because you can have more than one print layout for any given project. And I often do if I'm making maps for, sometimes I do cartography for publications, like for professors that need maps and books and things like that. And so we'll have the same data set, but we'll style it a couple different ways and or zoom into different parts of it. So having two or three print layouts is not uncommon when I'm working with that kind of data. I'm going to go ahead and click save just because it's here. This save in the print layout saves the whole project. So just something to be aware of. The first thing I do when I come in here is I right click on the blank page and click page properties. And this is going to let me change the size of the page that I want. So the default is A4. In the US, it's more typical to have letter size. So I'm going to pick letter for me. I'm going to leave it landscape because this is a fairly horizontal data set. But you could pick whatever you like. When I'm working with cartography for publications, for example, often we're talking like 5 by 5 inches for page size. You want to challenge yourself, try making a tiny map. Okay, so we've changed our page. Now what I need to do is add in all of the items that I would want in my page itself. So it doesn't assume that I want a map in there. I have to add every single thing, including maps. So your icons may be in a different spot. Mine are down the side for the most part. So I'm going to start with this add map icon. It kind of looks like a little scroll with a little plus on it. I honestly don't ever remember what each of these icons does. So I end up mousing over it until I get the tool pop up because I will not remember. So that's really helpful for me. So I'm going to click on add map. And then I'm going to click and drag to make a box. And that box is going to be the size of the map. And I don't have to get this right at first. I can always resize it. And then when I release my mouse, it will pick that size. And I can tell you right now, I'm going to resize this because it's not centered on the page and I probably want to fill up the whole page. So I will adjust that in a second. Now it's previewed the data that I've got. It defaulted back after I finished with that tool. It switched to the select mode. It won't always do that. It does do that when you add a map because you don't want to keep adding maps. But you should know to switch back to that. I will forget and leave it on the other option here, which moves the map data itself. And then I often end up crumbling at the computer. So anyway, select mode lets me change the size of things. So I can use that and I'm going to snap. I'm going to click on the handle, I'm going to drag and snap it to the corner of the map or of the page, just so I fill up the whole thing. The other thing I want to do is, well, we'll get to moving data in a second. I'm going to make sure that my map itself is selected, and you can tell because it has little selection handles. And then I want to look at the item properties for this, and I can see that right here it tells me what the scale is of the map itself in this particular page. So I think when I was playing with this, I noted that I had a scale of about 40,000. So I'm going to try that and see if it works at this this size of page. Today, it should, in theory, work. If not, we'll make some adjustments. It's going to take it a second to redraw the map, especially with the tree data. Okay, that fills up the map pretty well. I could play with this and fine tune it a little bit, but this scale number works just like map scale normally does, zooming in and out. Inevitably, you'll forget, just play with the numbers, it'll be fine. And then I want to move this because right now the city of San Francisco, this peninsula actually, this is land right here, but I don't have that. I could download like natural earth data and add in land, but I'm not going to do that for the workshop. I'm going to use this tool to move the item content. And when I click and drag, it's going to move, let me recenter that map so that I can bring that down to the bottom of the page and kind of hide the fact that I don't have more data that goes south of this particular area. And that will work for my purposes also, because if I want to put a title, I've got some space up here to do that. I'm going to go ahead and click save again. Okay, so we've seen how to add a map to our map composition and how to redo the scale, and then also how to recenter the content. I will note right now, I'm noticing that the scale changed just a little bit. Often when you move the data, like when you recenter it, it'll recalculate the scale and it'll just be slightly different. I'm not worried about that in this case. I would change that if I was doing a text scale, like, 1 inch equals 40,000 inches or something like that. I would fix that, so it'd be a nice even number, but for this, it's not going to matter. So now we can add, that's the main thing that I typically do. Now we can add some of the other things that you might want to put on a map. I'm going to show you well, not all the things probably, but I'm going to show you a bunch of things, and I will tell you, you don't need all of these on every map. I just want to show you where they are so that you can know if you need them. One thing I'm going to show you is how to add text. So there is this button that has a little T in it, that's for text. I'm going to click and drag and tell it where I want the text to be. And then it puts, the default is this sort of fake Latin word stuff in here so that you can actually see it. We're going to come into the item properties for this and highlight that. And we're going to type in the box, and it's going to change what's in the map itself. So I'm going to call the title of the map Canary Pines in San Francisco. And you'll see that it sort of auto updates here. That text is really small. I want it bigger. So I'm going to come down, scrolling down in the item properties, and I'm going to change, I can change the font. If I click on that, it defaults to whatever it is it defaults to. I'm just going to pick probably Calibri, because I know that's a nice clean font. Probably gonna make it bold just to make it stand out a little bit more. Font color black is fine. In the font interface is where I pick the size. One thing that's handy to know is that 72 inches for font is approximately 1 inch high on a printed page. So that's pretty big. Oops, click on the wrong thing. 72 inches, maybe I'll try 36. I'm going to drag that and make it bigger and make some more room. So I can adjust, again, with the selection tool, I can adjust and make sure that that is where I want it. And then if I want to center this, I can make this the same sort of width as the page and then tell it to center the font. And then that's hanging out in the middle, which is nice. Move this up so it's not on top of the island there. Okay, so that's workable, just for showing you how to do text and how to work with that. There's other options down here, like rotations and frames and stuff like that. Play with that. You can also look up how to work with all of these things in other tutorials. And also we've got quite a few talks coming up over the next 3 conference days. So you'll learn more about that if you tune into those. So some of the other things you might want to add, I'll show you where to put in the legend. So legends are challenging. So I'm going to click legend and then draw a box, and it will just make it whatever size it needs to be. You can see that the default is for everything that is in the, oops, I accidentally zoomed, is everything that is turned on in your layer panel. So actually, no, it's everything that's in your layer panel by default. So it's showing like the DEM, even though we don't have that turned on. But the good news is there's layer properties for the legend as well. Everything in the layout has layer properties. So what I can do is look in here and decide, how do I want to change this to be more useful? So there are options. I can add a title. I fall into the camp of not putting titles on my legend. I feel like I don't need to label it legend, but you can if you want. That's up to you. There are other things in here. big important thing is if I leave it on auto update, it's going to update the legend to match whatever is in the layer panel in the map canvas, which is not what I want. So I'm going to uncheck auto update, and this is going to let me make changes. So for example, I want to scroll down, and I know I don't need this DEM because it's not in my map. It's there for something else, but I can click minus. It's not going to delete the layer. It's just going to take it out of this legend. So minus gets rid of that. They don't need to know about the shoreline. It's going to be pretty obvious once they do some more styling. Seismic hazard zones also are not showing up. So I'm going to take that out. So right now I've got my street trees, I've got my center lines. I might mess with this. There are options in here where I can actually get rid of this and just keep the canary pine. See if that'll, yeah, I can get rid of the other option. So you can play with this. There's a lot of ways to refine this and make it less legendy, I guess, if is that a word. But I tend to prefer, from my own personal cartographic style, I tend to be fairly minimal. So that's why I'm kind of cringing about leaving it the way that it is. I would pare this down a lot, but I think that for time purposes, there's it's not as useful to sit there and fiddle with stuff to make it absolutely perfect. You get the general gist of this, and you can play with this, and now you know sort of where to look for some of these menu options. Let's see, I see movement in the chat window, so I'm going to check and see. Let's see, so question, when you lose the layout manager, how do you get it back? So if you accidentally closed your layout, how do you open it? I'm interpreting that is what the question is. What I would do is come into project and then click on layout manager, and then I would pick the layout that I wanted to work with. In this case, I just have the one that I've been working with, but if you had multiple ones, there'd be a list of them. So then you could, I think if you click show, it'll do that. I'm going to click close though, because I already have it open and I don't want to freak out my QGIS while I'm trying to teach. So hopefully that helps you find your layout manager again. And then a question about how do you change your units from millimeters to inches? That's a good question. So in your layout, typically if there is anything that asks you about sizing, it probably has an option for drop down. Occasionally I found some of the interfaces right now don't give you the option, and then I end up just using Google to translate whatever units I have in my head into whatever units it's asking for. But I think that's in the net, you know, there's been a lot of progress in the programming of this, so I expect some of that will change. So if you're looking for changing units, typically there'll be a drop down that'll let you pick different units. But if there's not, sometimes you just have to translate. The other thing you might want to add is a scale bar. So I'm going to show you how to add that. So again, I click the scale bar button and then I have to draw the box for it, but it will kind of default to the size that it needs to be. So I can make this box a little smaller, but it's not going to change the size of it. Obviously, this is not where I would leave it in a finished product. But so we've got our legend, or not legend, scale bar by the default. And then if I click on item properties, again, I have a lot of properties I can work with. The map tells it, you can have multiple maps in your layout. So maybe I wanted to have like a zoomed in and a zoomed out map panel. And so I have to tell it what map to pick from. In this case, there's only one, but if I had a zoomed out one, for example, I want to show where San Francisco is in the world, there'd be multiple map options. I can pick the style, I can do single box, I can get super fancy with lots of options. Again, my personal style is to keep it simple. I often will actually take this down to just one box instead of two. For my scale bar, I can change my units. These are, you know, not map units, but real world units. What does it relate to? So we can, my brain likes miles still. I know that's not common in the rest of the world, but that's what we typically use in the US. So switch that if I want to, or you can make it how you want. You can also change the label here. Like it's hard to tell because the handle is over the top of it, but the abbreviation for miles, in this case, it's suggesting MI. I could write that out, like if I wanted to put miles instead. that will change and put the units there. I can also change the number format. You can change the number of segments. Like for me, I typically just want one, and then I will adjust and see if I can. Sometimes I'll try to get this a really nice round number, like show 1 mile instead of 0.75. But you can play with this. Oh, there, this is how you change it. So if I want just 1 mile, I can just do 1.0. And then my scale bar will be a nice round 0 to 1 miles. I can change the color of the fill. I can change all kinds of stuff about it, but you get the idea. That's how you can work with adding a scale bar to that. And again, you can get pretty fancy with this. I personally tend to keep them pretty simple, but depending on what you need or the style for your particular maps, like if your office, for example, has a map style, you can actually set a lot of those things. You can also add north arrow, so you can put in the north arrow. You can change what this is. I tend to go super simple. I also fall into the camp of folks who tend not to put north arrows when north is up. If I think people will know, like if I'm doing this map for the city of San Francisco, they know what the orientation is looking at the street. So I wouldn't necessarily spend the space on that. But I can also add things like if I needed to add, for some reason, if I needed to add like different shapes to it, like if I wanted to highlight something with that, I can build those things in. There's a lot of stuff you can add with this side panel, but we don't need to go through absolutely all of it. Now you know that it's there, you can play with it. And there's also some really good tutorials in the QGIS training manual. It's got some really good more information about how to do all of this. So definitely check that out too if you're interested in learning some more about that. So I have made a fairly cluttered, not super great map, but at least you've seen now all of the different things. And then you can also look in the written materials for the workshop to see some examples of you know, what you can do with this and play around with your own, like try this, you know, working on your own map and adding things as needed. Okay, so I would also add that I've got links in the written materials too to other places. Like if you want to download some more background data layers, like natural earth data or project line work or GATM are good places to get, for example, like coastlines and things like that that extend south of the city of San Francisco to finish that out and not be a cheater and just cut it off at the edge of the data. But so that's how you make a map. And again, you can get pretty sophisticated with this by picking different options and things like that. And I actually do a lot of my my cartographic work with QGIS, setting it up. And then if I need to do something super polished, I'll actually export this to Inkscape and work with it there. So I guess that's a good reminder. I should show you how to export. I'm going to click save because I see the save button. Up here at the top, you have, again, your menus might be in a slightly different place, but you have a couple options for exporting. You can export this as an image, an SVG, or a PDF. For the most part, most people are going to want the export to PDF or image. If you use SVG, that's handy if you want to bring this project into an art program like Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator. The SVG will export all of the line work as lines with nodes at all of the bends in the line and stuff like that, so you can actually edit it in an art program. But for the most part, if you like the way that it looks and you want to put this into, say, a report or put it on a website or something like that, and you want a static image, you can export it as an image or a PDF, depending on, you know, your audience and what they need. So I'm seeing some questions coming into the chat. So how do you add a second map to show different layers than the one we've done? Oh, that's a bigger question. I can show, you can definitely add another map image. If you click add map and draw a box, it will default to what is in the map layout. So in the main QGIS window, there is a bunch of tricks you have to do with turning on and off what is locked. So before I would do that, if I wanted to add another map window, I would make sure that my map is selected, and then in layer properties, I would want to lock my layers and then lock the styling for the layers. So I'd make sure these two things are checked. And what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that I don't change anything in what I've currently got. Because if I don't do that and I go and I turn things on and off or change the styling in the map layout or the map canvas in QGIS, it's going to auto update here. So locking the layers and locking the styles is going to make sure that this stays put when I make changes. So if I wanted to add a new map, I'm going to add map. This is going to get really cluttered, so I apologize. So maybe I want an overview map. I'm going to put this here for now. And it's going to make a new map, and it's going to start rendering in a second. It's being a little slow. But ideally, okay, there we go. So now you can see it's like a mini version of what I currently have. If I go to my map canvas and let's say I turn off my streets and turn off my trees, and maybe I want to do the DEM. Let's just do that. That's easy. So I've got my DEM. And now I come over here. I'm going to have to refresh this. And so now I've got my DEM in the little window. Maybe let's put this here so it's actually on the page. But now see, if I hadn't locked the layers of the other one, it would update that and everything would just be the DEM. Now I've made a really atrocious looking map, but at least now you've seen how we can add different layers. And the key is making sure you lock your layers in the other one before you add a new map. Sometimes what I will do actually is I will set up a print layout and make a copy of the print layout and then put the things in the two print layouts in, like I'll make this layout with just one map and then a placeholder for the other one. And then I'll make the same layout, but leave this map blank and update this one and export those separately and then join them up in an art program. Sometimes, although that's a lot of work, sometimes that's easier when you've got a lot of updates that might happen. Like if someone's making tweaks to a data set while I'm working with another researcher or something, sometimes that can be helpful, but you really have to, if you do it in the way that we just did it, you have to have a really good idea of what you want to do, set what you've finished, and then set it for good, and then move on to the next thing, because going back is going to be challenging. So the question is, can you go back to editing the first map by unlocking it? Yeah, you can. If I unlock it now, though, and then I hit refresh, it'll become the DEM. So I'd have to put everything back. So that's why I say it's kind of challenging. The workflow itself is sometimes challenging. You really have to know what you're going for. Like, this is what the main map's going to look like. I'm going to finish it exactly the way I want it. And then I'm going to switch to the next map to work on. That's why sometimes I'll do them in parts so that I can kind of put them together. And I might have them in two separate projects even if I know things are going to change around a lot. Sorry, I just saw Leah said that she was going to answer that and I beat her to it. Sorry, I was looking at the chat when the question came in. So for those of you on streaming on YouTube, we've got folks in the Zoom session that are asking questions in the chat. So that's what I'm responding to. Okay, so any other questions about this? Again, this could be its own workshop in itself. And there are going to be some talks, like I think Gretchen Peterson's talk later today is going to cover some map examples. So you definitely, if this is super exciting, definitely check out her talk. Again, all this is going to be recorded too. So you can, if you miss it today, it'll be on the QGIS North America YouTube channel to check out. Yeah, so Jason's saying you could use the group layers feature to turn things on and off. That's also true. You'll come up with your own workflows for making these. If you're doing a lot of map work, you kind of have a workflow that you tend to go to, and the first few that you do is more challenging, but as you sort of figure out what the order is that works for you to do things, then it'll go quicker for the next ones. Okay, so again, we're at the end of a section and we're about at the end of an hour. So I think let's go ahead and take another quick break. So I've got on my clock, it's about 5 till the next hour. So let's meet up. Let's take a quick break and we'll meet up on the hour. So here in the city of Davis, it's almost 10 o'clock. So let's meet back here when my clock says 10 and we will finish this up. We've got one more section to go. So we've got great timing. We're gonna do some spatial analysis when we come back. So go stretch, go get a snack, whatever it is you need for your bodies, but definitely move around because we've been sitting for a long time. So we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes. All right, so if you've wandered off, hopefully you're making your way back to your computer screen. I appreciate you guys sticking it out. This is a really long time to sit at your computer and listen to someone demonstrating software. So thanks for hanging out with me today. We've got one more hour scheduled on the workshop. We've got one more section of the planned material to go through, and then we'll do, if there's time at the end of that, we'll do some Q&A and asking of stuff. So again, thanks for sticking it out. This is our last section to get through, and we've made a lot of good progress today. So what I'm going to do, coming back to my QGIS project, I'm just going to go ahead and click save because that little star up there in the corner told me I had done changes and not saved it. Obviously, this map is not finished, but I think for our purposes, that's good enough. We've seen some important things for the layout. I'm going to go ahead and close that. And again, I can always get back to it if I need it. So the last thing I want to show you is doing some spatial analysis. Again, we're going to be working with attribute tables with the vector data, but the purpose of this is to do a select by location analysis where we're going to look at the locations of two different types of things in our vector data and start to do some analysis with that. So again, this is building on some of the things that we've been learning already today, but taking it another step forward to do a little bit different, maybe a little bit more formal analysis rather than just visual. Okay, so what we're going to be working with is I'm going to turn off my DEM. I'm going to turn on the seismic hazard zones, and I'm going to turn on my street trees again. So what we're gonna, I know there's not a lot of contrast in that right now, but we'll fix that. So what we're gonna be looking at now is another kind of plausible scenario kind of situation where we're gonna be trying to do some analysis to answer a question. So my question here is, I've got my tree data, and then I also have these what's called seismic hazard zones. So the city of San Francisco has outlined these areas of the city that in an earthquake or a seismic event, these are areas that would be suspected to have pretty heavy damage. So these are places where there'd be a lot of shaking. For those of you in California, you're very familiar with the term liquefaction, which is a process that happens to the ground when you have earthquakes. So these are areas that are outlined that are a little bit elevated danger for in an earthquake situation. So I was thinking like, okay, I've got trees and I've got seismic hazard zones. So what I want to do is take a look at where are there really large trees that coincide with seismic hazard zones. So earlier we looked at trees by species, but also our street tree data has information about the tree size. And where that is, I'll open up the attribute table. If your computer's having a hard time loading this file, don't open the attribute table. I'll just show it to you. And mine's going to take it a second to open because it's a lot of data. But there is a column in this table that has, it's called the DBH column. And it stands for diameter at breast height. That is a way to measure a tree. So what you do is you figure out how wide is the tree, about 4 feet off the ground. So you think about chest height, and that gives you a measure for the size of the tree. So between individual trees of the same species, we can compare size. So height might not actually be diagnostic, but the trunk width actually is. So I'm looking at my street tree data, the attribute table. And so we've seen a little bit of this, like here's our Q species column. We have other information about this, but we have this DBH column. So this DBH is in inches, and I know that from the metadata. So I'd have to know, someone would have to tell me what the units are on this. But I could probably guess, knowing that this is city of San Francisco, this probably isn't meters because a 15-meter wide tree is not going to happen. So I can guess that this is probably inches. It might be centimeters, but the metadata tells me that this is inches. And that's pretty common for urban forestry in the US to be in inches. You can see that there's some nulls in there. For this analysis, I'm not going to worry about it, the fact that there are nulls, but we're just going to work with the data that we have. But obviously, if I was doing research, I'd want to find out what's going on with that, why they're null. make some decisions. But for this analysis, I'm going to decide that I don't care about the nulls. We're just not going to worry about those and work with the data that we have. So I'm going to define a large tree as a tree having a DBH of 36 inches or higher. So that's 3 feet across, about a meter. That's pretty big tree. Like if we're thinking about the width of the trunk is that big. So I would be concerned if that tree is in a seismic hazard zone. I might want to know that because I want to make sure that tree is really nice and healthy so that I wouldn't be concerned about it in an earthquake. So I want to do this analysis. I've got, I'm going to go ahead and close the attribute table for now. So I've got my trees. Right now it's just showing canary pines, but we know we have all the trees in there, and then we have our seismic hazard zones. I could potentially, I'm going to turn on all the trees just because I can. If your computer again is having trouble with this, don't turn them on. I'll show this to you and then we'll do the analysis. And this is where we're going to actually pare down this table and make it smaller so that it'll look better. But so this might look familiar. We've seen this. If I'm trying to count the number of trees and trying to count the number of big trees in these areas, I don't want to do this by hand. I really don't. I'm going to figure out a way to do this with a workflow here that does the selection and things like that with the help of the computer's tools, with the GIS tools to do this. Obviously, like if I wanted to do a bunch of this, I would actually program this in like R or Python, but if I'm just doing the analysis once, doing it in QGIS makes total sense. Okay, so what we're going to do is, first thing we're going to do is pare down this street tree data set because this is pretty large. So okay, so first thing we're going to do is I shouldn't have closed my attribute table. Let's open up our attribute table and we are going to do our attribute selection, just like we did before when we were working with the streets. We're going to go through the same process, but we're going to do this with the trees and we're going to pick out the big trees. And then while this loads, I'll preview that we're gonna save the big trees as their own file, and then we won't have to worry about the CSV that's taking forever to load. So waiting on that attribute table to show up. There it is. Hello, attribute table. Okay, so again, what I want to do is just like we did before. Oh, it's still thinking about it. Where'd you go? Apologies. Computer's done so good so far. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to click on this select features using an expression, just like we did earlier today. So I'm going to click on that. Remember, it's the little button that looks kind of like a sigma over a little yellow box. So just like we did before, right? We've done this 2 other times today for different things. I'm going to click on my fields and values. And remember earlier we looked at the Q species column because we want to find all of the canary pines. But now we want to use this DBH column. So I've got DBH, and then now instead of equals, I want to do greater than or equal. So I'm going to type in the greater than symbol and then the equal symbol. So QGIS will interpret this as being greater than or equal to. And then I can see in the preview here in the middle, it shows me that the DBH column is numeric. It has that 1, 2, 3 icon. So then that means I know I can type in just the number 36. So this is a time where I would not want to click on all unique because it could be anything and there could be thousands of things in there and that would take forever to load. So don't do that. So we're going to type in DBH is greater than or equal to 36. And in this case, we know it's inches because we have the metadata, but again, we're not going to put in the units in this interface. It just has to know that. Okay, so once I have that set up, then I'm going to select the features and hopefully it will select all of the trees that have a diameter of 36 inches or more. It's going to take it a second because remember, this is a pretty big data set. So one thing I can do if I want to just see the selected ones, I can use this tool or I can use this one, which moves them to the top. It's going to take it a second to do that. I can also see that there's a selection that, oh, perhaps I need to clear out my rules. Sorry, my computer's being a little slow now that I have this big data set. Well, it should do that. Sorry, I'm thinking to myself out loud. So I'm trying to close my interface and it's going to be a little slow. I imagine some of your computers may be doing this too, just taking an extra second to load. When this comes back, I'm going to remember to hit the save button. So in the meantime, while we wait for this to load, if anyone has questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. I see we're doing some problem solving in the Zoom chat, which is great. Just going to give my computer another, hopefully a few seconds to figure out what it's doing. Okay. So there we go. So now it's showing me it has selected, looks like about 4,000 trees from our very large collection of trees. And I hit that button, this one, to move the selection to the top, just so I can see that I've got a bunch of things selected. And if I scroll down, it'll eventually get to things not being selected. But that's great. I'm going to minimize that in theory. So we're about to subset this data set, and then hopefully computers will start behaving a little bit better. I'm just trying to minimize that. Okay, so this is still being a little bit slow. This is normal with this data set. It's just really big, so sometimes it does take it a second to figure out what it's doing. But so I'll preview for you. The next step we're going to do is we are going to take the selection that we just made from our street trees, and we are going to save that as its own vector file. So we're going to save it as a shape file. There are other options though for vector data. Shapefile is probably still the most common data set, but because it, like you saw earlier today, shapefile is, so I just click save because my interface came back and I want to save what I've got. So shapefile comes in, it has all those files that have to stay together, what I referred to as the shapefile entourage earlier today. That can be a little troublesome for data management because you have to keep everything together. And if they get separated, then the whole thing stops working. So I actually prefer GeoPackage, which is an open format. It's one file. So that's easier for data management. I just have to keep track of one thing. And it's an open format, so that's nice. The other option is GeoJSON, which is text-based, which is really handy for example, if you need to store stuff in GitHub, it does really well there. But it can be a little slow because it's text-based, so it's kind of like how the CSV is slow here. Okay, so hopefully by now, your computer and my computer have started responding again. So let's solve this problem of having this massive CSV. Let's make it a little smaller. So I'm going to click on my street trees in the layer panel. And I'm going to right click, and now I'm going to click on, or I'm going to hover over export so it opens up the next menu. And then I want to pick the option for save selected features as. The only difference between this option and the one right above it is a checkbox, which you can check once you've opened the interface. So don't sweat it if you pick the wrong one. So again, I'm going to pick save selected features as. So the second option on that menu in the export. Move it over on the screen that you can see. So again, my format options, I can pick shapefile, which we are going to do today, but you have all these other options for various things. But I'm like I said, we're going to do shapefile just because that is probably the most common. For the name, we're going to give this file a name. We're also going to tell it where it's going to live. So I'm going to click on the ... button because this will let me navigate to where I want to put stuff, and that way I know where it's saving. So I'm going to put it in my my data with my workshop data, and I'm going to call this file large trees. So this is going to be largetrees.shp, and I'm saving it in the folder that I want, which is my workshop data. You can save it wherever you want, but that's where I'm going to put mine. Okay, so that path is now in that that text area, which is great. For the CRS, it is guessing that it should be WGS 84, which is correct. That's the one that we started with, so let's keep it there. If I needed to change this, I could click on the CRS button and pick a new option, or the dropdown has the ones that I've been working with. Yours will probably be smaller if you haven't used QGIS before. Again, you can change your character encoding. We're going to leave it UTF-8. Here's the important part. This checkbox for save only selected features. So what this does is whatever we have selected in the attribute table is now going to become a new file, and the rest of it we're going to forget about. We'll still have the CSV with all the trees in it, but the new file we're going to make is only going to have the big ones. So we have some geometry options. I'm going to leave the defaults. The rest of this looks fine for now. You can also, I'm going to expand this fields option. If, for example, you wanted to only export some of the columns and get rid of others, you can do that here by unchecking them. But we're going to leave the defaults. And then the last part here, just to make life easy, there's this option for add saved file to map. What this will do is when it finishes saving the file, it's going to put it automatically in our map interface so we don't have to go find it. So I like to do that when I'm making data I'm going to use right away. It's going to click OK. You can uncheck that though if you need to export it and you don't need it in your map and you don't want it to load, you can uncheck it. So we've got a little progress bar at the bottom. So it's telling me task is complete. Woohoo! That's exciting. So the first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to uncheck our big street trees and just have my large trees showing. I'm going to click save because I'm remembering to do that. Now it kind of looks like fall colors in my map. Again, these are just default colors. It's picking them somewhat at random. So someone's asking, is it okay to put spaces in your file names? I would not do that. And the reason I tend not to put spaces is because it can get, certain tools can get confused by a space, and then you'll have to use an escape character, and it will save you a lot of headaches down the road if you just don't put spaces. If you want to put a space and you shouldn't, you can use an underscore instead, or sometimes a dash. That can be another good option, but I would avoid spaces because that tends to fall into the category of special characters that can cause problems later on. Some tools like plugins may not be able to understand what the space is and they won't be able to open a file. So generally spaces are a no for data management. All right, so hopefully everyone has gotten their large trees now in its own file. So it should look roughly like what I've got. So you can see we're looking at spatial distribution of large trees. They tend to fall along some of the major roads. They've probably been planted for a really long time. And so now we can actually start to see if we're concerned about big trees in seismic hazard zones. We can see on my map, the seismic hazard zones are orange. Yours is probably a different color. And the trees that are showing up, there are some that are in these areas and some that aren't. Again, we don't want to do this by hand. So we're going to figure out how to do this in a more repeatable way using some of the selection tools. Okay, so again, to repeat, we've selected out our big trees. We've saved that as its own separate file because that will make our life easier dealing with less trees. So now we're going to try to figure out which of our trees that we have remaining in our data set, which of them coincide with the seismic hazard zones. Again, I could zoom in and I could select all these by hand, but I don't want to do that. One, it's going to take a long time. It's going to be tedious. And two, I'm probably going to miss a few of them and I don't want that. So I'm going to do this with a tool that's going to do this for me and figure all this out. So I'm going to come up here. We haven't worked with the menus at all yet. I'm going to click on my vector menu. So remember, we're dealing with vector data. This is why I went over raster versus vector in the beginning, because we all need a refresher. And also a lot of the interfaces depend on you knowing the difference. So working with vector data, and then I want to come down to the research tools option, and I want to pick this option that's select by location. So again, vector menu, research tools, select by location. And all this also, if you want to review this, is in the print materials as well. Okay, so I've got my select by location interface, and the way we're going to set this up is it kind of reads like a sentence. So what I want to do is read through this. So select features from, in this case, I want to select features from my large trees. And I want them to intersect with not large trees, because that's silly, that's the same thing. I want to pick seismic hazard zones. So I'm going to select my large trees that intersect with my seismic hazard zones. There are a bunch of other options in here, like contain, equal to, overlap. And you can read about, if you Google that, you can read about specifically what the specifics are of each of those options, but intersect basically means that the tree is sitting on top of or coincides with the seismic hazard zone. So you can think of it as if the tree is inside that polygon in some way, shape, or form, it's going to be selected. And then if it's not over a seismic hazard zone, it's not going to be selected. So we can, the other option here, we can, if we had a selection already made, for example, we could add it to the current selection. There's multiple options, but we want to create a new selection, mainly because we haven't done any other selections yet. But just know that's an option. So then I can click run. And the result of this should be trees selected that fall within our seismic hazard zones. Just previewing that looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. So I have all of my, the trees that, all of these points that look like they're over the orange blobs are now turned yellow because they've been selected. The ones that are not over the orange blobs are still brown, so they're not selected. If I look at the attribute table, which should load quicker than the one with all the trees, you can see there are some selected and some not, which is great. So it looks like we have 432 trees that we want to be concerned about. And then the rest we're not concerned about. So, okay, we made a selection, but remember we talked earlier about how we don't want to rely on selection for making maps. If we need to communicate this beyond just exploring it for ourselves, we need to figure out a way to make this visible in some way. So what I want to do is, in this case, now that I've done my selection, I want to actually add a column to my attribute table for my large trees that says whether or not it's in a seismic hazard zone. And again, I could, because these are selected, I could make a new column and I could go through manually and add some indicator for each of these. I can do it by hand. But I don't want to do it by hand. There's 432 of them. So let's find a way to do this automatically. And the way I want to do it today is with the field calculator. So you can click on this button. It looks like a little abacus, if you know what an abacus is. Otherwise, it just looks like little colored dots. So I'm going to click on that. And again, this kind of looks similar to what we've been working with before. A lot of these interfaces function in a similar way. So if it's looking familiar, that is a good thing. So what I want to do is make sure that this box is checked up at the top for only update the 432 selected features. This is because I only want to indicate the ones that I've selected. I'm going to make a new field. So I'm going to make a new column. And then I want to give my column a name. So my column is going to be called, I'm going to call it EarthQ Zone. With Shapefile, you're limited in the number of characters you can have in the column name. That's not as much an issue with other formats, but because we're working with Shapefile, I have to be careful not to name it something too long or it'll get cut off. So that's the name EarthQ Zone, because for me, that will remind me, oh, this is an earthquake zone, but you can name it whatever you think will be helpful to you, given the limited number of characters. For the field type, I don't want to have whole number. I believe I want to have text for this because I want to put yes if it is a tree in a seismic hazard zone. I could do zeros and ones instead, but I've decided to use yes and no because that way we're 100% sure, like earthquake zone, yes, earthquake zone, no, that makes sense to me. So in this box, what I want to do is if it's selected, I want it to have the word yes. So I'm putting single quotes wrapping around the word yes. And what this is going to do is if it's selected, yes is going to go in the column. If it's not, it's just going to leave it blank. And you can see the preview here is the word yes for the things that are selected. So that's all I need to do. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and it'll take it potentially a little bit of time. Mine went pretty quick right now. You can see if it's highlighted, the earthquake zone, earth Q zone column has a yes. If it was not highlighted, it has a null. So that's where I'm going to leave this for our analysis, and we can now, oh, one thing we need to do that I'm remembering is when we started our field calculator, it automatically enabled editing. So it turned on the editing mode. So what I want to do is before we finish this out, I want to go ahead and click the save button. This saves the edits. So this one is specific to the attributes that we've been editing. So I'm going to save my edits. And then what I want to do is the button next to it, I'm going to toggle the editing mode off. So this means that I won't be able to accidentally edit anymore. So if I double click here, it won't open this field up for editing the way it was earlier when I was clicking around. So now the editing has been saved, it's turned off, so it's safe, I can't edit anymore. But I've got all of my big trees and seismic hazard zones marked yes. So what I'm going to do also is now we've got this saved in the attribute table, I don't have to keep my selection anymore. I can turn off my selection. And now if I wanted to, so they all just look like trees now, but I could come in here and I could say, oh, I want to categorize it, do my symbology based on the last one, Earth Q zone, classify, and then I've got yes. And so this is a situation where the all other is helpful. It's taking a second to do the figuring it out, but eventually it should change them to red is yes, and right now the default blue is going to be no. But so we've got this. This is a way to do your spatial analysis using a series of selections, and then save it for later use. I'm not sure why it's not classifying, but that's fine. We don't really need that right now. But so if I was going to make a map like the one I have in the workshop materials, oh, that one doesn't do the different colors either, but that's fine. We can do this visually, or we can have it do our categories the way that we've got it. I'm not going to troubleshoot this right now. So that is, I believe that is the list of things that I had planned on showing you today for the workshop. If you scroll down to the very bottom of the workshop materials, you can see some more links to, for example, the QGIS documentation. I highly recommend looking at the training manual. It's got some good step-by-step instructions for how to do pretty much anything that you would want to do in general. For more specific stuff, you'll have to do some more Googling or poking around in the interface. But for the typical GIS interface kind of stuff, the training manual has excellent resources for showing you how to do stuff. And then the link to the Open Source Geospatial Foundation has links about news and projects and things like that you might be interested in. All right, so we've got 20-30 minutes left in the workshop. So what I'd like to do is ask, is there anything that you guys want to see demonstrated, or any questions that you have about QGIS and how to do things? Okay, so I see some questions about what types of files it can open. For the proprietary spatial database formats, you can open them. I'm not going to demonstrate how to do that right now because I would have to have one at hand to show you, but there are some good workshops online that'll show you, or tutorial type things online that'll show you how to open those. There's a couple extra steps that are a little bit different from how we opened up the raster and vector data today, but it is possible to open those. Is it possible to import an MXD file? There is a group that's working on that. I'm not sure what the progress is on that project, but that is in the works to open MXD files and import those. I would caution you though that generally I want to pick my tool that I'm working with ahead of time, and it's really not that big a deal to sort of remake a map sometimes. I don't know. Basically, I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. That can be a bit of a challenge to reverse engineer things that are proprietary. Okay, so someone's asking about labeling capabilities. Yeah, so let's do some labeling. Let me just poke at this seismic hazard zone. Oh, bummer, it just has IDs. I was hoping that it had some kind of label. I'm trying to think what would be good to label. Maybe if I zoom in on the trees, it will be easier to label these. I'm just trying to think what makes sense to label and what's not going to be just an absolute mess. So I'm going to just zoom in on a section here of some of the trees, and maybe we'll do some labeling with those. So let's see, if I want to do labeling, I'm going to make sure that my large trees are selected because that's what I want to label. And then in my layer styling panel, I'm going to click on the labels tab. So you can see the default is no labels, but I want to pick, in this case, let's do single labels. You can also do rule-based labeling, which is really similar to like the rule-based symbology that we worked on, where you're going to write a rule that only labels, for example, if I only wanted to label canary pines, I could use a really similar query to what I had in the symbology, but single labels for now. So you can see the value that it's going to be working with. So the column right now is tree ID. Let's label it with species instead. And let's see. So I'm going to click apply. That is atrocious, but at least now we've seen that we can label it. We can always refine as we go. I'm going to pick a font that makes my brain happy, something cleaner. So I tend to go, I'm going to live update this so it just makes the changes. So you eventually, the more your cartography you do, the more you'll kind of have like fallbacks and that just make you feel comfortable. You can always go wild later, but so that I'm kind of running through my checklist, mental checklist of how to fix things. Okay, so that's okay. This is one of the tricky parts about why, if you're making a database like this, you might not want to put so much information into a column, because these make for kind of crazy labels. But so there's that, that's labeled. If I wanted to, I could, in this value option, so I could just pick a column, or I could use the expression dialog, which again looks really similar to the selection stuff that we've done. And I could work with that font and with the text, and I could cut it off. One thing we could do that might help, I'm going to click cancel out of that, is there's a bunch of tabs within the labeling. So I could, looking for the one with the wrapping. I never remember where anything is. I just fish through it until I find it. So my wrap character here, this tells it like wrapping means I'm going to put a return carriage. So I'm going to put at a certain point within my text, I'm going to put basically make a new line. And so instead of one line, I'm going to have 2 lines here, because they have this repeating character. I might have my wrap character be the 2 colons. And so now you can see it's maybe a little less visually busy. And then I might make my line height a little less, so they kind of group up a little bit more. This is already starting to look better to me. It at least is grouping up. One thing you'll notice is with the labels is when you have a bunch of points that are really close together, it's not labeling everything because it assumes that that's too busy. You don't want to see all that. You can actually have it, there's an option in here to label everything. Again, I don't remember when any of this is, even from day to day. I just keep looking through the menus until I find it. It might be this one. Here we go. So show all labels. So on the very end option tab here, show all labels. This is going to make a ton of text. But again, if I'm doing this, if I'm making a map for someone and everything needs to be labeled, I will have it label everything and then figure out how to deal with the fact that it's doing this. Like I might need to zoom in. I might need to do leader lines, which is an option. You can there's a menu that you can use, this one up here, to actually move the labels by hand. So I might try to untangle some of this and put leader lines on them. But yeah, I probably wouldn't make a map with this labeling the the names this way because that's just a lot of text, but you might have to. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how to do labeling. Obviously, there's a lot of intricacies to this that, again, could be its own workshop, and I think we'll probably have some, I think I should know this, but I think that there may be some options to see that. And also there's some good YouTube videos out there as well to get some more information about that. Okay, so one of the questions, how do you push a map up to the web for a web page? That is definitely its own workshop, but I would recommend looking at the QGIS to web plugin. That's really helpful. Maybe I should show you plugins since we've mentioned it twice now. So the questions about how to do the web mapping stuff is definitely something to look up on your own. I don't have the capability to show you that right now. It's something I've done, but that's a lot more detailed than I'm prepared to demonstrate, but just know you can, and there are tools. So let me show you plugins really quick since we've mentioned it twice. So up at the top of your menus for QGIS, you have this plugins menu. If you click on it and you click manage and install plugins, it will open up your plugin manager. And what plugins are you can think of it as like added pieces of software that you don't necessarily want them all turned on because you may never need them, but the ones that you do want, you can turn on and select to have those available. One plugin I would recommend everyone get, maybe not install it right now because you're trying to live stream stuff, but for later, shoot. It's not going to let me look at, sorry, menus popping up. I don't think you guys can see from Zoom. Yeah, I'm going to close this. I want to, quick map services, that's the one I want. So I'm going to go back to my plugins. I'm going to search for a plugin called Quick Map Services. So as I'm typing in the search box here, it's starting to filter. This one called Quick Map Services is really helpful. It has base maps from various different groups. Like you can get OSM, you can get Google satellite, stuff like that. Mine's already installed, so my interface will look a little different. There'll be a button here to install, so you could do that. Like I said, maybe not right now if you have like a slower internet connection. Save that for once we finish here in a couple minutes. But so you click install, and then once it's installed, we're going to click close. And then it shows up on my web menu. So I have Quick Map Services. When you first start it up, it won't have as many options. You can go to the settings, and I would recommend in the More Services tab, Get Contributed Pack. The reason that it doesn't load everything is because you have to agree to the terms of service. So like, for example, Google has it's not a completely open, like the data isn't completely open. You have to agree to use their terms of service. So just be aware of that, but it's really helpful. So if I just need to, like, a lot of times I'll want to check and make sure data is showing up in the right spot. I'll come down here to OSM, turn on the standard OSM, and then I've got OpenStreetMap data in the background. That's a tile service. So that's an example of a plugin. So it's things that, maybe your colleague will never need this, so they don't need to have all of this loaded, but I can turn on bits and pieces of this code through plugins to get the tools that I specifically want or need for what I'm working with. And you can also, one of the advantages is to having an open project like this is you can make your own plugins. So if you're familiar with Python programming, you can make your own plugins. I have made my own with in collaboration with a colleague that does, basically it works with citation software to turn your citations into mappable objects. So you can do a literature review and map it to find out the spatial distribution of studies. But so, I mean, normal people, oh, wow, that just changed all my labels. I'm gonna turn off the labels on this. That was really distracting. But so like normal people don't need that plugin. They don't want that capability turned on, bogging down their computer. But if you do want it, you can get it as a plugin and you can have that capability. So plugins are great for that, adding tools to things you might need. The other place you can look for tools is in this processing toolbox. So if I click on processing and click on toolbox, I have these other things, like for example, I mentioned grass earlier. If I wanted to do some raster processing with grass, I have access to, I'm pretty sure, all of the different raster algorithms that grass does. I've got the vector stuff. So if I wanted to access grass through QGIS, I can do it through the processing toolbox. So added capability there for different things, as well as things that are in your menus up here. So this is why I mentioned that QGIS is kind of extendable. There's a lot of things you can connect to it to make it do other things that are useful to you. So I'm looking at the chat. So helpers, feel free to just jump in and tell me if there's something you think I should answer specifically. That's super important.
Somebody asked a question about sharing maps, and I was looking up if there's an equivalent to, I know in ArcGIS you can do the map package, which saves having to, so basically to share a map you need both the map, the QGIS project file, and also all of the files that you're using. But is there a way to package that like there is in ArcGIS?
Normally I would say no, but it looks like Leah, you have a follow-up that Kurt says it's possible with the, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to spell this out, SLYR plugin, or if I'm supposed to make that into a word. But that talk is going on today, actually later today. So that might be a good thing to check out. I'm going to be running the behind the scenes stuff, but I'll definitely pay attention to that because that sounds really helpful. Generally, I would say though, for good practice, I tend not to give people my project files so much. I would rather, this is just my personal preference, like I would rather finish the map for them or create their own file. I find sometimes it can create confusion, but definitely you want to be careful if you are sending people the project file, like the QGZ file. In order to open that, you do need to have all the data come with it, and it needs to be structured in the same way. Just the same situation with the proprietary software. If you're using like the ESRI products, everything has to come with it. So just be aware of that. But generally, I'd say I think maybe the landscape on this is changing, but I try not to send people project files. I want to send them a finished product more than a project file. But, you know, depending on if you're working in a group, that may be a different situation. So generally, I would say if you want to share a map and it's a, you know, basically you want them to see a certain product, I would say go ahead and make a map in the print composer and export either an image or a PDF and give them that versus especially if you have a colleague who's less familiar with GIS, if you give them a project file, now they have to work with the GIS and that may not be something they're super comfortable with. So I would prefer personally to send people a finished static map or put it on a website or something that they can, if you wanted to make an interactive website with the data, you could do that too. So I'm looking, is it possible to load data that you use for the finalized map? Sorry, I think my thing skipped. Is it possible to load a photo of an old map and disguise the boundaries, i.e. fields? So Tony, if you can clarify.
Digitize.
Oh, digitize. Oh, sorry, digitize the boundaries. Sorry, it's been a long day. So again, I'm just going to whine a little bit here. I've been up since like 5:30 this morning, my time. So my brain's a little getting to the end of its capabilities. I apologize. I can read. So, okay, can you take a photo of an old map and digitize the boundaries? Yes, you totally can. There are going to be 2 talks in this conference next Friday. So this conference is happening this Friday, next Friday, and the following Friday. So 3 Fridays in a row. So basically the middle of the day on next Friday, we've got 2 workshops, or I keep calling them workshops, 2 talks in a row, my talk and then the one following my talk. We're both going to be talking about how to use old maps for digitizing. So I'm specifically going to talk about how a project went looking at really old maps from the mid 1800s for the Central Pacific Railroad. So I'll talk about that. But basically the process you're going through is something called georeferencing, and you can do that with your raster menu. There's this georeferencer plugin. It used to be a plugin. I think it might be standard now, but if it's not on your raster menu, you can turn it on with the plugins manager. That's the tool you're going to use, and I would recommend, that's not something I can demo really quickly today in the time that we have, but there's some really good tutorials out there on how to use the georeferencer. But that's the process you're going to go through. So you'll load in your unreferenced map. You'll match up points on your image that's not georeferenced to your base map, and then you'll run the process that turns that into a spatial object. So that's a pretty common task, but definitely check out the 2 talks that are going to be happening next week on Friday for that. If you want to take a look at the program schedule, that's all on the QGIS.us website. So hopefully that at least gives you some idea that it is possible. And again, like we didn't do that's raster data. We didn't do a ton of raster data today, but all of this is very much larger than we've been able to cover in just the intro workshop. So Leah says geo packages are a really good option, and you can send the layer formatting with it. Definitely, we're moving towards we're moving away from shapefiles for vector data, even though that's been by far the most popular and most shared option. I imagine if I was tweeting this on Twitter, the shapefile account would now be harassing me. So yeah, we are starting to move away from shapefiles towards more open things like geo packages that have a little bit more capability that you want. So I would definitely consider that. And there's a lot that's been written about that too. So if you want more details, I would highly recommend doing some more research on that. I definitely would, in my own work, when I can, I do tend to use GeoPackage or alternatively GeoJSON, depending on the situation. I tend to not use shapefile as much anymore, just because, like I said, it's a data management issue when you have so I'm going to show you my files here. If I go into my workshop data, I mean, you've all seen this because you have this similar structure. I have all these files, but there's really only 3 in here, right? It would be much nicer if this was just large trees.geopackage, seismic hazards.geopackage, instead of having to keep all this straight. So I would definitely encourage you to work with some of the more open formats now instead of shapefile. But for accessibility with the workshop, I wanted to use something that people were more familiar with. You know, sometimes it's better to learn one thing at a time than dump all kinds of new things on people. So how do I save a project as a geopackage? So I think you need to save individual data as geopackages. I would definitely go to the workshop or the talk later today about saving things with that new plugin, the SLYR plugin. That's going to happen in a couple of hours. So I'm going to click save. So that's, I think, let me pop over to the YouTube group and let's see if there's any questions there. I know that they've had a lot more questions, I think, moving on. I think Kurt's doing a great job answering them. I think this is too much to read right now. Maybe I'll pop over there and answer some questions later after we finish up. So also you might want to, here I'll link to the YouTube. Don't try to stream this all at once, but just so you've got it. The YouTube, I just sent that to Leah instead of everyone. Let me try again to everyone in the chat in the Zoom session. Go ahead and take a look at the questions that are going on over there as well. They're having a slightly different discussion on the YouTube chat and some different answers as well. And Kurt's over there answering, and he, I think, has more experience with this aspect of QGIS. The more you get into this, the more you'll realize there is so much stuff here that no one person's probably going to know every single thing. So that's a good place to look right now. Also, you can join the QGIS mailing list from OSGeo or the QGIS US users group mailing list if you're in that geographic area to ask questions and get help. There's also a really good community on Twitter. If you're a Twitter user, if you use the hashtag GIS chat, that usually gets some eyes on questions there. And again, the documentation for QGIS is great. I'm always referring to that and sending people there when they're asking for help. So check that out. I see Leah has an answer to the question of how to create a GeoPackage layer. So she says, I'm just going to do the instructions. She says, I'm going to go to layer, create layer. There it is, second one on the list. A new GeoPackage layer. So that's pretty simple. And then fill out the interface and you're good to go. All right, so we've got, we're just about finished up with time here. I want to thank you all for joining me. And for those of you who stuck it out for all 4 hours, give yourself a big pat on the back. Here on the West Coast, it's just about time for lunch. So if you have not had your midday meal, go have a snack at least. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me for 4 hours. Wow, that is an accomplishment. And I hope we've learned a lot today. The materials, the written materials will be on the GitHub repository. And like I said, I just update them with new versions of the software. So they'll be there for you to refer to and ask questions, you know, of the various forms we talked about. So yeah, thanks again. I'll hang out here for another minute or two answering any other questions that come up, but go enjoy the rest of your day and move, please. The 4 hours of sitting with minimal breaks is it's definitely time to move after 4 hours. All right, thanks everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end the session now. And thanks again to the YouTube folks that were in the overflow parking there watching the streaming. This has been definitely an experience.